Good day. Welcome to Design Impact Straight Up Talk, Homelessness, Ethics, Policy, Action. I am Peter Coombe, Chair of the Alumni Council of the Graduate School of Design. The Alumni Council is the representative body of the nearly 14,000 GSD alumni worldwide. We are grateful for our sponsors, the Harvard Alumni Association, the Harvard Alumni Architectural and Urban Society, the Harvard Kennedy School Alumni Association, in particular David Rosenberg and Meredith Siegel, Covenant House International, the Boston Society for Architecture, AIA Los Angeles, AIA New York, AIA Seattle, the Open Source Homelessness Initiative, Hunter Tura of Syndicate X, and his team of talented designers, my Alumni Council colleagues Anna Pinta da Silva and Ricky Nishimura. And in particular, our fabulous Associate Dean for Development at the GSD, Peggy Burns, and her dedicated colleagues, Brad Quigley, Lindsay LaGrasse, and Pamela Larson, who have made today possible. Most of all, we thank the more than 1,200, from more than 60 countries who's registered, and in particular, you who are joining us today. These numbers are evidence of the significance of today's topic. The mission of Design Impact is to challenge us as a global community to use design as a tool for actionable, transformative change and healing. Design is our lens and our imperative. Today, we address homelessness. The legal definition of homelessness is an individual or family who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. New York and Los Angeles, home of many of our panelists today, have the two largest homeless populations in the United States, and the second and fourth most worldwide. By law, New Yorkers are guaranteed a right to shelter, yet the city has roughly 80,000 homeless. Los Angeles homeless population is slightly smaller at 60,000. Please see the reference section of our website for more information about today's panelists and other advocates for the homeless. I encourage all to review New York's Coalition for the Homeless 2020 State of the Homeless report. Can U.S. homelessness be eradicated? Today's curators, Alice Kimm and John Friedman, posit as a society our moral imperative is to take the steps that will do the most good for the greatest number of homeless. And we must center affordable housing and social infrastructure as emblems of civic pride that above all else engender dignity for those the design serves by meeting their needs. According to Binyamin Appelbaum, our first keynote speaker, to get there, we need to radically realign our society's priorities, and that begins by eradicating entrenched indifference. Now it is my sincere pleasure to introduce our wonderful Dean of Harvard's Graduate School of Design, Sarah Whiting, the Joseph Louis Sert Professor of Architecture. Sarah?
Thank you so much, Peter. And I want to thank Alice and John as well for curating an extraordinary list today. Then thank you to the Alumni Council generally for bringing this, this presentation to so many people. It's maybe one of the upsides of Zoom is that we can have hundreds of people come together around critical questions. And it's also a fantastic way for the GSD alumni community to come together as a network that can actually do a lot of good for the world. So I hope that this format continues far beyond the pandemic as something that has come out of the pandemic as a positive thing. This topic of homelessness couldn't be more timely. We know on December 31st that the federal moratorium, eviction moratorium expires, and then that puts 30 million people at risk of losing their housing in the United States. And that's just a number that is so hard to get one's head around. So what has been a crisis for years is something that's becoming just an extraordinary issue in the United States, and one that I'm very happy that we're facing. I also really appreciate the format today of looking at questions of ethics, whether housing is a universal human right, questions of policy, and questions of action, of how can we do something about this. And while many people might say that design is not really the solution for the question of homelessness, I think that bringing this issue in front of a group of people who are involved with design is a way of making the world better. And this dovetails nicely with the Joint Center for Housing Studies look at the issue of homelessness earlier this year, when they brought in Michael Maltson and looked at the issue of the Skid Row Housing Trust in Los Angeles, the example there. So I am delighted to introduce our first keynote speaker, Binyamin Appelbaum. It's always a little bit nerve-wracking to actually see a journalist in person because we're so used to seeing his byline. So Binyamin is the lead writer on business and economics for the editorial board of the New York Times, as many of you know. His article from last May 15th, his opinion piece called America's Cities Could House Everyone if they chose to, came to all of our attention. And it's a remarkable article. If you haven't read it, please do. And it's this article that got the Alumni Council to push me to invite him for this keynote, and much to our delight, he accepted. And so it's my delight to turn the microphone over to Binyamin and also to the beginning of this extraordinary event. Thank you very much.
Good morning. In the 1950s and the 1960s, in the decades after World War II, it was easy to find optimistic predictions that homelessness in America would be eliminated by the rising prosperity of American society. Since that time, the income of the average American has roughly tripled in real terms, and homelessness has become a much bigger problem. More than 500,000 Americans on the average night last year slept somewhere other than a permanent home. Some huddled in overcrowded New York shelters, some pitched tents under bridges here in Washington, D.C., some curled up in the doorways of San Francisco office towers. In Los Angeles County, they use heat-seeking drones to find people who have dug little holes in the desert to find shelter for themselves and their loved ones. And it raises the question of what has gone wrong in our society. And I think the simple answer is that we don't have enough housing, especially in our most prosperous cities. Homelessness is often portrayed as the result of individual bad choices or bad luck. And it is undoubtedly true that the people who end up homeless are disproportionately graduates of foster care or of the prison system, victims of domestic abuse or discrimination, veterans, people with mental and physical disabilities. But the first law of real estate applies to homelessness too. Location, location, location. Homelessness is concentrated in New York and in the cities of coastal California and in a few other islands of prosperity, because in those places, the dearth of affordable housing means that people who have problems are much more likely to end up on the street. There is a simple statistic that illustrates this pattern. In 2018, 8 out of every 10,000 Michigan residents were homeless. In California, that figure was 33 out of every 10,000. In New York, it was 46 out of every 10,000. The difference between Michigan and New York is not the prevalence of mental illness or substance abuse. The difference is the scarcity of affordable housing. The pandemic, of course, has made everything worse. Rents are down right now in some major cities, but I'm skeptical that we'll see any lasting shift in the demand for housing in urban areas. Meanwhile, we stand on the cusp of a wave of evictions, as the Dean just mentioned, that could send a new cohort of Americans into the downward spiral of homelessness. There is no better predictor of an event of homelessness than a prior event or episode of homelessness. Once people lose their housing, they're much more likely to lose it again. Much of the current population of homeless individuals in America are people who lost housing during previous periods of social and economic disruption and have never been able to completely recover. In particular, a cohort that entered homelessness in the early 1980s and remains a disproportionate share of the nation's homeless population. We stand on the cusp of letting a new generation slip into homelessness. Last year, I spent a day in Santa Monica, California, with a team that included a social worker and a doctor who go out into the field each day to work with people in the community who are homeless, to try and help them, to try and connect them with social services. And it's a frustrating experience. Many of these people feel like if they aren't beyond help, it's very difficult to help them. And after one encounter, I asked one of the people that I was walking with what really could be done to help that person. And what she said has really stuck with me. She said, housing 6 months ago. The point is that what begins as a problem that can be corrected quickly by affordable housing then becomes much more complicated. It's true that people with substance abuse and mental health problems are more likely to become homeless, but homelessness exacerbates those problems too. Homelessness is easier to prevent than to cure. So that's the bad news. But there is good news too. We know how to prevent homelessness. We know how to help people who are homeless. We can render homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring here in the United States. All we need is the money and the will. Americans have taken to treating homelessness as a sad fact of life, as if it were perfectly normal that many thousands of adults and children in the wealthiest nation on earth cannot afford a place to live. Collectively, we are choosing to avert our eyes from the people who sleep where we walk. We have decided to live with the fact that some of our fellow Americans will die on the streets. We can do better. Congress could shift billions in annual federal subsidies from homeowners to people who don't have homes. Instead of subsidizing mansions for millionaires, which is a major priority of federal fiscal policy, we could make sure that everyone has a place to sleep at night. We need more market rate construction to relieve the pressure on existing affordable housing. The government calculates that $600 is the most a family living at the poverty line can afford to pay in monthly rent while still having enough money for food, healthcare, and other needs. From 1990 to 2017, the number of housing units available below that price shrank by 4 million. And that's primarily because those units got priced up, although in some cases because they were demolished and replaced. And the loss of those units was concentrated in exactly the places where we've seen a sharp rise in homelessness. We also need more subsidized construction, particularly in the areas where jobs are concentrated. And looking at the agenda today, I know we're going to hear some interesting ideas in these areas from the panelists later on. And we need to provide direct assistance to people who cannot afford housing. President-elect Biden proposed during the campaign to provide housing vouchers to every American who needs government assistance. Right now, those vouchers are available to only about a quarter of the eligible population. Making that program in effect into an entitlement would have a huge impact on reducing homelessness in America. Now, we also need to help those who are already homeless. And those who will lose housing in the future as an inevitable consequence of disruptions. Fortunately, we know how to do that. The federal government has had enormous success over the past decade in reducing homelessness among veterans. The government reported just this past January that homelessness among that population has been reduced by 50% over the last decade, from about 75,000 to about 37,000, even as overall homelessness counts have climbed. 3 states and several dozen cities have provided housing for their entire veteran populations. The program basically uses a triage approach, calibrating aid to need. People who just need a security deposit get that. People who need long-term housing wrapped in social services are provided with long-term housing wrapped in social services. The annual price tag to help every homeless person in America is enormous. It's roughly the cost of 1 aircraft carrier. We are facing a choice as a society. Are we willing to let elementary school students spend nights in guarded parking lots, a phenomenon that's become increasingly common as a solution to homelessness in the Western United States? Is it worth spending just a little bit of our vast national resources to ensure that no 60-year-old woman needs to sleep on the same bench in downtown Santa Monica, California, night after night, because, as she told me, it's relatively flat and it's easy for the police to see her from their cars? Is it tolerable here in Washington, D.C., where I live, for people to live in tents on the scraps of green space along the highways that fringe the neighborhood where Jeff Bezos has recently connected 2 townhomes to create the city's largest mansion? Are we okay with that? It's up to us.
Thank you, Binyamin. When I read your article, I was actually moved by your use of the word indifference. It seems that for any solution, we need to recalibrate our priorities. And as a designer of public space, and maybe Dean Whiting, you want to join us for this brief conversation, we are often tasked with creating solutions that move the homeless elsewhere. You described that park bench in Santa Monica. Typical park bench designs now have dividers so you can't sleep on them. We are told to remove amenities from public spaces to the detriment of those public spaces when we don't seem to be willing to confront the real issue, which is providing a solution for homelessness. And I think the goal of today is to start looking at what those solutions may be. Dean Whiting, do you want to jump in for a moment before we start our next panel?
No, I mean, I had a similar question for Binyamin, whether he has thought of the sort of tie to design, to the public spaces, to the thresholds, and you mentioned all the doorways and possible thresholds, or to the and hotels. Even one of our guests has already put in the chat the number of homeless who have been housed in hotels. And I wondered whether you had any comments to that effect, Binyamin.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's striking to me is that, you know, design is a reflection of the priorities of the society, and we often see it deployed in American cities today as a defense mechanism, a means of warding off the homeless. Benches in public parks studded with, you know, objects to make lying down uncomfortable, restrictions on the design of public space intended to preclude their use by people who might want to stay more than briefly, and that's tragic. There are also other examples. Here in Washington, the city has launched a program to construct supportive housing for the homeless in each ward. The first of those buildings just went up in my neighborhood. It's a brilliant piece of design. It's a lovely building that really speaks to an investment in helping people who can't help themselves. And so, you know, you can deploy design in the service of the wrong priorities or the right ones. And I'd like to see it deployed more often in the service of the right ones.
I appreciate that response, and I appreciate your fantastic writing on this topic and others, and maybe just a call from this group to have you include design as part of your next piece that you write on this topic would be great.
Very well taken. Thank you.
Thanks for your
Thank you,
wonderful.
Sarah. And thank you, Binyamin. Now, turning to our first panel, I am profoundly pleased to introduce our two design impact curators, Alice Kimm, FAIA, and John Friedman, FAIA. John is also a member of the Alumni Council. John and Alice are partners in the Los Angeles architecture practice of John Friedman and Alice Kimm Architects, and have recently launched Open Source Homelessness Initiative, OSHI, a nonprofit organization that seeks innovation in the design of housing and support facilities for people experiencing homelessness. John?
Thank you very much. And good morning, everybody. We're super happy to have you with us today. Now, as Peter just mentioned, I've curated this symposium with my partner, Alice Kimm, and you'll see her a little bit later. And as you've also probably noted, in addition to the keynote you just heard, we've organized this event into three panels, one each based around the themes of ethics, policy, and action. What we're hoping to provide is a thoughtful exploration of homelessness, one that first takes us through its causes and its costs, then investigates the policy issues that exacerbate it, also looking for policy issues that can reverse those impediments. And finally, we're going to show effective, tested solutions that individually or together can eradicate homelessness. And here we have boots on the ground panelists who have devoted their careers to finding answers, because one of our primary goals is to provide the knowledge and the information for people to get involved, to actually to make a true difference. So in a moment, we'll start with the first panel, panel one. And the prompt there is an ethics question. Is housing a universal human right? And beyond the moral issues, we realize this inevitably will lead to the deeper cultural, political, and economic issues that make homelessness such a difficult problem to tackle in the U.S. And this is really this is a vexing state, considering what other cultures and countries accomplish with far fewer resources. So now we have a very distinguished panel, which our moderator will soon introduce. But first I'm going to introduce that moderator herself. Denise Ghartey is currently a Justice Catalyst Fellow and attorney with the Community Justice Project in Miami, Florida, where she focuses on community displacement, climate gentrification, and racial justice work. Before that, she attended Harvard University's Law School, where she graduated in 2019 and was awarded the William J. Stuntz Memorial Award for Justice, Humanity, Human Dignity, and Compassion. In fact, throughout her upbringing in Cambridge, Mass., and then her college years studying philosophy at Hamilton College as a Posse Scholar. She's dedicated the majority of her time helping the underprivileged and the homeless, working towards a more just society overall. And with that, I'm happy to introduce the baton to you, Denise.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for being here today. I'm really excited to speak with all of the panelists and to have a really great discussion. So I will kick it off and introduce the first panelist, who will then talk about their work and go through some slides. So Michael Lehrer is a founding partner at Lehrer Architects. Michael Lehrer was educated at Berkeley and Harvard and founded Lehrer Architects LA in his native Silver Lake district of Los Angeles. His work, grounded in the idea that beauty is a rudiment of human dignity, is designed for community and rooted in Los Angeles, a deeply non-judgmental and open city of seamless indoor-outdoor living. Lehrer Architects LA has won over 140 major design and sustainability awards, including 3 Institute Honor Awards from the American Institute of Architects, AIA. Michael is Chairman Emeritus of Harvard University Graduate School of Design and Alumni Council, past President of the Homeless Healthcare Los Angeles, and past President of the AIA's Los Angeles chapter. In 2020, AIA LA awarded Michael its highest honor, the Gold Medal. And with that, I will turn it over to Michael.
Thank you, Denise. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to everyone. Architecture is the shaping of space with objects and light to create practical and emotive places. Homecoming, this grace from disgrace. 3 rubrics: ethos, delivery, and design. Making home is a primal act of the architect. From homelessness and COVID and Black Lives Matter to homecoming, what seemed daunting, if not impossible, mere months ago has happened. Attitudes, positions, implementations have changed in ways that are scary, exhilarating, disorienting, promising, and not. Tomorrow will tell, but perhaps being our best selves seems more possible now. In COVID time, the entire world has consciously and subconsciously a renewed awareness of home and its centrality to human existence. The houselessness and affordable housing crisis in Los Angeles is at once beyond imagination, and yet it is the very unavoidability of sisters and brothers living on our streets that finally commands everyone's attention and action. Home, where histories begin and where values are born. Deep-seated into our wiring as humans, as part of the animal kingdom, the primal hut is so much more than need. It is the fundamental place of privilege. From the untended to homeless on the street to the well-homed, shelter as safety, identity, state of mind, importance, power, prestige, accommodation, memory and prophecy, aspiration, sanctum, autonomy, agency, and harm reduction. The idea that you meet people where they are at with no judgment, and particularly people on the street, but everyone. That's the overarching rubric of an organization I've been working with for 20 years, Homeless Healthcare Los Angeles, providing supportive care to folks in the city. The idea of lived experience, that as architects and in general, we need to talk to people and interact and learn with our sisters and brothers who have lived experiences that only they can know and understand. So if we have the continuum of housing, we begin with the untended to homeless on the street. At the bottom, no services, no nothing, and the most daunting problem. Then we have the tended to homeless. In our case, we designed the downtown homeless drop-in center 20 years ago. It was radical at the time. Over its 13 years in operation as such, it had over 3 million visits. It was a sanctum and respite for people from the street. There were showers and laundries and a clubhouse there and a safe place to be. Let's see, and it's nearby, a block away, we designed what we call the living room for Skid Row. This was the Jim Woods Community Center in 2002. For 18 years, it is providing a classroom space, and a gathering place for folks for the community of Skid Row. Out of these two projects came the understanding for me that beauty is in fact a rudiment of human dignity. Then we have transitional shelters. Now, people in shelters are still homeless. Recently completed, this was 5 weeks in design, 4 months in construction for 70 beds in the San Fernando Valley, pre-made buildings on the right, a custom-made building on the center, on the left. And the question in designing this was, how do you do to create a place of dignity and joy and community for these folks? We're currently doing two projects. These are the first pallet housing projects in Los Angeles, 13 weeks from the beginning of the design to end of construction, 8-foot by 8-foot units, arrive on pallet. They take 3 hours to build. The site will take about a month and a half to build. This will open in January, and a place of community and dignity. In terms of delivery, we have a team which we formed in the last 3 years, Rethink Housing. There's a nonprofit developer, Restore Neighborhoods Los Angeles, a community bank, Genesis LA, and ourselves. One-stop shopping, small sites, all projects by right, no parking, and grounded in a philosophy of we're going to make mistakes along the way and we're going to learn from them. A project finished early in the year was transitional housing. These are 2 units with 5 beds in each for youth now at promise, not at risk. Shortly going into construction after a very, 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 very ridiculously long haul. This project in East LA for 8 youth at risk. These are all micro units. This is beginning construction next week in Willowbrook. And then these are larger projects we're doing, all with micro units. The big idea is that all of our projects are single loaded corridors, exterior circulation, and most importantly, cross ventilation for all these units, and nice big windows in every single unit. These are 3 projects which will all be in construction in the next several months, mostly in South LA. And a critical idea in all of these projects is that not only serving those formerly houseless people, but enhancing the neighborhoods. It is absolutely critical that these projects honor and enhance the neighborhoods and become projects of desire in every neighborhood to form complete communities. We began this affordable homes 5 years ago. We were hired by Restore Neighbors Los Angeles to do 3 prototypes for 9 sites, about 1,200 square feet per house, 3 bedrooms each. They cost about $350,000. And our client, Restore Neighbors Los Angeles, came back to us and said, that's too expensive. That is too expensive for a starter home. So he said the goal will be to do a project that's all in about $200,000. So the last project we'll see is our single family starter home, 1,000 square feet, 2 bedrooms, possibly 3 bedrooms. And amazingly, 3 years after it was completed, it happens to be on the cover of Dwell this month, which is important in terms of storytelling, which is a big part of design. And what we've done was, how do you fit these projects into their neighborhoods? Use the tools of design. You use geometry, you use parterre, the design of the ground plane, and color. And real smarts, hopefully, in terms of what you can do special to make these houses sort of not only honor and respect the people who live in them, but also to honor and respect and enhance the neighborhoods into which they go. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm excited to talk more, particularly about kind of creativity and how we combine creativity and human dignity and design, because human dignity is a center point of human rights. And so this is our panel, this is our conversation, and I'm excited to talk more about that in the discussion. But next, we'll move on to our next panelist, and I will introduce now Richard Sennett. Richard Sennett is the chair of the United Nations Habitat Urban Initiatives Group. Richard grew up in Cabrini Green housing projects in Chicago. He attended Juilliard School and then Harvard, where he worked with David Reisman and Hannah Arendt. Professor Sennett currently serves as chair of the UN Habitat Urban Initiatives Group, is a senior fellow at the Center on Capitalism and Society at Columbia University, and a visiting professor of urban studies at MIT. Previously, he founded the New York Institute for Humanities, taught at New York University and at the London School of Economics, and served as president of the American Council on Work. His books on social life in cities, changes in labor, and social theory include The Fall of Public Man, The Corrosion of Character, The Craftsman, and Building and Dwelling. Among other awards, he has received the Hegel Prize, the Spinoza Prize, and the Centennial Medal from Harvard University. Thank you so much, Richard, for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. This is a wonderful event, and I'm very pleased to be here. I decided that what I'm going to tell you a little about is what we are doing in the UN to think through the issues of homelessness. In general, our approach you can find in reference 11, I think, from the handout for you. This is the Habitat 3 session, where this meetings in 2016, where we began to address this issue fairly squarely. And my own thoughts on that are contained in part of that Habitat 3 document called the Quito Papers. The meeting met in Quito. I thought I'd just say a word today about why homelessness of the sort that we're trying to deal with is really such a great contrast to the issues of homelessness that frame, in a way, this meeting. Or maybe I'm wrong, and you'll tell me if I am. Informal settlements, squatter settlements, where people have appropriated space or land that doesn't belong to them. They are at a thin edge of always being homeless because they don't own the places or have a right to the places where they live. And in general, our approach to this with squatter settlements has been to try and convert use into right, basically to give people land title for the places where they live. But an extreme issue that we're now dealing with and I'll describe it to you in one city, is where you have masses of people who aren't even able to appropriate space on which they can build. We're working, for instance, in Delhi, which has, like many big cities in India, has a huge population of street dwellers who are people who sleep on the streets at night. These are people at the way bottom of the economic ladder who have almost no resources to command in society. In Delhi, originally, we were seeking to make shelters. If Michael's shelters would have been a dream for people there. But the numbers of people who are homeless that way are simply too great. Of Delhi's approximate population of 27 million, there are 2 million street dwellers. So it would be a situation where we don't, and there's no will in the national government in India to address that problem. So rather than take people off the streets, we've been thinking about how to humanize the situation on the ground, which is how to humanize the street itself. A typical place we're working is something called Nehru Place, which is a big open air market in the southwest corner of Delhi, which during the day is It's if you want to buy an illegal piece of electronics, that's where you go. It's a very mixed place. At night, it's home to between 8 and 12, maybe some nights, 13,000 people who sleep in this massive open space. And what we've been trying to do is, bring porta cabins, bring in food, and so on, to make the experience of being homelessness something which is not absolutely without any help from outside resources. And as they say, it's at the extremes. You find this in Africa as well as throughout the subcontinent. When you're dealing with extremes of homelessness, the issue is not to get people off the streets, but to do something about their lives on the streets themselves. I guess the one thing since we're just in the middle of the pandemic, I should say about this is that what we found is that the strategies we're using are basically strategies which are informal. When Nehru Place is full of Muslim sleepers, as it often is, we have to adapt the kinds of food that we'll serve there, for instance. We have to make informal lines between where poverty-stricken Hindus and Muslims sleep. So it's been a kind of planning which is dealing with these facts on the ground very informally. COVID, and this is the last thing I want to say to you, has broken the effectiveness of this strategy because there are limits to informal help that have appeared with the advent of COVID. It requires institutions. It requires, in the first instance, getting people off the streets, but it also requires a level of institutional building, which is simply, respirators, all of that sort of stuff, which is not something that can be provided informally. So what I'm describing to you is we've learned is a strategy which is realistic, but very limited. And I think it's maybe, and I hope it's resonant to you, in that that's the same thing in much more privileged societies, like the United States as well, that informal people-based controls don't work for the pandemic, and they may be the limits for dealing with this homelessness situation when it's faced with an exceptional state, with a state of exception. So anyhow, that's what I think. There's both a contrast here and maybe a connection between the kinds of discussions we'll have today.
Thank you so much, Richard. Again, definitely really excited to talk more about, a lot of the points that you just brought up. In particular, pulling a quote from one of your books, you quoted Hegel saying, "Human beings are fulfilled only in being acknowledged by others," which I think humanizing and bringing dignity into this space, I think is a conversation that definitely needs to be had. And I'm excited to talk more about that. But now I have the pleasure again of introducing another panelist, Leilani Farha. Leilani is the former US Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing and the global director of The Shift. Leilani, a lawyer by training, has tirelessly advocated for the realization of the right to housing throughout her career. She is the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. In that capacity, she traveled to Serbia, Kosovo, India, and Chile to investigate and comment on the state of the right to housing. In addition, Leilani started The Shift, a global movement that calls for everyone to approach housing as a human right. She is the current executive director of the NGO Canada Without Poverty, and previously served as executive director of the Center for equality, rights, and accommodation, where she helped launch a historic challenge to government inaction in the face of rising homelessness. She was a founding member of the ESCR-Net, an international network of actors committed to economic, social, and cultural rights. And with that, I will turn it over to Leilani. Leilani, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Denise. I thought I would start my comments by turning to the title of this panel. And I think that posing the question, is housing a universal human right, is actually problematic in and of itself. And the reason I think that is, I think questions for esteemed panels like this actually help to set agendas. And I actually think the question isn't a here and now question. I think that we should be asking far more provocative questions. Questions like, given that housing is a fundamental and universal human right, how is it possible that in the United States of America, we have more than 500,000 people living in homelessness, and the threat that 30 million people would lose their secure tenure and fall possibly into homelessness? Now, that's a question that I like to answer. That being said, I figured for the record, I will say that of course housing is a universal human right. And you all in the United States, those of you who are from the US or living in the US, should know that of course Eleanor Roosevelt was key to ensuring that the right to an adequate standard of living, including housing, be recognized as a human right way back in 1948 through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So of course, since 1948, there have been a plethora of treaties that have codified the right to adequate housing, some that the US government has ratified, some that the US government hasn't, but that governments around the world have. We now have in the Sustainable Development Goals a recognition of the elements of the right to housing and political commitments with respect to that. So given that there is indeed a right to adequate housing, we have to start using it to understand phenomenon like homelessness. And one of the things that I have found so remarkable in my work is that people living in homelessness themselves actually recognize and understand deeply that housing is a human right. I know this most recently from some work I've been doing through the shift and with about 30 organizations from around the world. Since the pandemic struck, we've launched a kind of global homelessness action that will come public on December the 10th, International Human Rights Day. But we asked people around the world who are living in homelessness to talk to us and to shoot little videos. And each and every one of them articulated almost the exact same thing. It's quite remarkable. They all articulated that they want and expect to be treated as human beings and to be able to live, to be treated as human beings and to be able to live in dignity. And those are the two fundamental aspects of the right to housing. And so that's also how we know that housing is a human right. And it's so amazing to me that, you know, these are people who living in all sorts of circumstances from all walks of life who understand deeply what the right to housing really means. It means to be treated like a human being and to be able to live in dignity. When you adopt a right to housing approach to homelessness, it shifts your entire perception of things. It means that when you see people pitching a tent on pavement in Skid Row, that is a claim. It's a human rights claim. It is a right to housing claim. It is not a criminal act. It means recognizing the human right to housing means recognizing that people living in homelessness actually know something about their own lives and how they should be treated, and therefore must be consulted in any solutions to homelessness. And lastly, and this is what I love about a human rights understanding, it's very clear in international human rights law who has the responsibility to whom. Governments have responsibilities to people. So that means, and I'll end here, that when you walk by people living in homelessness on the street, instead of looking at that person and saying, oh, drug addict, oh, criminal, oh, lazy, oh, bad luck, misfortune, what you should say and what you should understand is no, that is the failure of governments to implement the right to housing. Thank you.
Ooh, thank you so much, Leilani. I was over here snapping while you were talking. My video was off, so you couldn't see me, but I was. Really excited to kind of get in to some of the nitty gritty with you, especially like problematizing the private equity firms and taking over of commercializing housing and land and what that means for some of the issues that we're talking about. And really excited to talk more with you about your ideas. With that, I will introduce our final speaker on this panel. And we've already heard from him today, but if you allow me, I'll introduce him shortly one more time. Binyamin Appelbaum is the lead writer on business and economics for the editorial board of the New York Times. Binyamin joined the editorial board of the New York Times in March 2019. A graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, he was previously a Washington correspondent for the Times, covering the Federal Reserve and other aspects of economic policy. Appelbaum has previously worked for the Florida Times Union, the Charlotte Observer, the Boston Globe, and the Washington Post. While at the Charlotte Observer, he was part of a team that produced a series on a local subprime mortgage crisis, which won the Gerald Loeb Award for Medium News, a George Polk Award, and was a finalist for the 2008 Pulitzer Prize in Public Service. And with that, I will turn it over to our final panelist. Thank you.
Thank you. So you have all already heard from me. So I want to make a couple brief points before we move into the discussion section. So housing is a human right. I believe that. I agree with Leilani, but the problem is that many Americans don't believe that, and that functionally in America, it's not an actionable human right. A person who walks into a courthouse and demands their human right to housing will not find any cause for action in the law. So I want to talk just for a minute about why I think it's so important for us to focus on convincing people that housing is a human right. And I think it would be great if we could find a way to write it into law. And the reasons are similar to the ones we just heard about. It reframes the discussion. It empowers individuals to claim what they need. It obligates government to provide what they need. And it shifts the way that we deal with homelessness. So in America today, much of our focus is on palliative care. We now spend about $12 billion a year providing temporary shelter for the homeless. And it's very striking to me that when you talk to people in New York, they generally perceive New York to be doing a better job of dealing with homelessness than Los Angeles. And the reason is that New York has been enormously successful in sweeping the problem out of public view. In New York, homelessness is largely shunted into these shelters, and people don't encounter it in the same way that they do in Los Angeles, where there are fewer shelters relative to the homeless population, and a larger share of that population is living on the streets and alongside the highways and in places where people can't help but see them and interact with them. And so what you get is this entire, and you know, I think that there's a lot of incredibly interesting things happening in terms of creating an infrastructure for the homeless, but much of it begins from the premise that there's something called the homeless population that needs to be accommodated and served, and that therefore we need to have daycare centers and places where they can shower and places where they can do their laundry. And these are important because homelessness will be with us, at least in the near term. But it also means that we are developing a language and an infrastructure around a problem that we ought to be trying to eliminate, and that I fear that instead we are accommodating. And I think that follows from the sense that is prevalent among policymakers in my experience, that homelessness is a fact of life, that housing is not in a functional sense a human right in the United States, that we are going to live with and tolerate some percentage of the population living in this condition. And so it's so important to talk about housing as a human right, because as long as that is the frame of the discussion, we're not going to make the progress that we need to be making. And the final point that I'll make is that I often get a little frustrated when these discussions are framed as being about homelessness, because helping the homeless is important and necessary, but it doesn't do anything to prevent people from becoming homeless. It doesn't help the people who, if we can just keep them in housing, won't become homeless. And to me, that is the much bigger problem. At any moment in New York, about 80,000 people roughly are homeless. About 800,000 are in a position of absolute vulnerability to homelessness. There are people who, cannot afford the rent on the apartment that they're in, or who are doubled up in an apartment that's inadequate for the number of people who are living in it, who are at real risk of ending up on the streets tomorrow night or the night after that. That population requires our focus. And that's why I think of this issue in terms of housing. And that's why I think of this issue in terms of, the human right to housing, rather than thinking about how do we help the homeless, how do we help everyone who needs housing, and how do we convince people that housing is a human right.
Thank you so much. And now I'll invite all the panelists who are on this panel number 1 that I just introduced to turn their videos on so that the audience can see us and we can have just a little bit of a back and forth and a little bit of a discussion. And I will say I've been looking at the chat and there's a lot going on. A lot of people are asking questions. A lot of people are supporting a lot of the statements that were made. Richard, you got a shout out. We have some people in Chicago. So just wanted to make sure that everyone knows that we have an engaged audience here. So I think Leilani, if it's okay, I'll address this first question to you, but I'm pretty sure that all of the panelists will have something to say about it. But Leilani, you have been, you in your cause have been the subject of the film Push. You've written articles for The Guardian, and you served as an expert on the right to housing for the UN, and you have stated that housing is not a commodity and that it is a social good and that housing is a human right. And you believe that adequately addressing this housing crisis with stating that housing is a human right will create a more just society in general. But what kind of economic or governmental system is consistent with that? With our capitalist system and unchecked market driven by private equity firms and speculation, what needs to be replaced? And how do we address the increasing control and power that private equity firms have over not only development, but community planning, zoning, and the common rhetoric that these firms are using to say that they're revitalizing largely disinvested in communities? And how do we operate within this system and advocate for housing as a human right at the same time?
Okay, that's a huge question. I'm happy to weigh in, and I really look forward to hearing the other panelists. Yeah, so I guess a good place to start is this idea about housing being a commodity, or housing as a human right, and where does that all fit in with capitalism? I guess what I would like to say to that point, and it's an incomplete answer, of course, is that what I would like to see is for capitalism to be responsive to human rights. So, and I say that because I don't think we've given capitalism a fair chance, because Binyamin was just saying about how unrecognized housing is as a human right, which I totally agree. And I don't think governments have really tried to make capitalism responsive to human rights obligations, standards, and norms. So I think, why don't we give capitalism a chance to respond before I'm not willing to just throw out capitalism. It's a system that obviously can work for some and has worked for some time. And I'm not sure that we have other models that are necessarily going to replace capitalism and that people will support. So that's how I come out the gate, and people will critique me right, left, and center for that. But that's how I come out the gate, because I'm a practical person. And I want to be strategic about this. And I think if I walk around saying, yeah, let's throw out capitalism, I think people will laugh at me. And I don't think that I actually believe that that's necessary. But could it be responsive? I think it could. I think what's happened is that housing has become overly financialized. It's become an uber commodity with uber money and uber interest. And I think that needs to be curbed and dealt with. And what I'm talking about is investor-driven housing. And it's not just the creation of new housing that is investor-driven. So Binyamin said in his keynote, that homelessness is the result of a lack of housing. And I think what he meant was a lack of affordable housing. And I think that that's probably true. And we have to look at what are the drivers of what is eating up affordable stock and why is not more affordable stock being created. And there are big financial forces out there that are eating up affordable stock. They're private equity firms that are buying up what they call undervalued properties, and then moving in, doing cosmetic upgrades and pushing up rents. Private equity bought a huge number of single family homes after the 2008 crisis and turned those into rentals, but not affordable rentals, pushed up the prices. We have Airbnb dominating city landscapes and eating up existing stock and turning it into short-term rentals. I could go on. And so, and we have entire buildings being developed for short-term platforms, et cetera. So I think we need to pivot and look squarely at not just sort of what are the levers to ensure more affordable housing, but what are governments doing to invite in this financialization of housing?
I'm interested, Richard, I'm interested in a little bit of what your response might be, but also in just to give like a little bit more context of like the perspective that I'm coming from is in your book, Designing Order, Experiments and Disruptions in the City. You presented readers with a kind of paradox, and you stated that the technologies which make possible experimentation have been subordinated to a regime of power which wants order and control. And I'm just wondering, related to Leilani's point in this point about, kind of capital and power and the control over the planning of our cities. If you can talk more about those tensions and our ability to acknowledge everyone's human right to housing and the right to live in dignity, and how this like power is imposed onto our vision of society and the geography of a city, and how that kind of relates to a little bit of what Leilani said.
Another small question. I think there are actually two questions there. In our book, what we're interested in is something very, very far away from homelessness, which is the abuse of smart city technology. And that's what my quote is about. So that's far away from this. I think the issue about this is that, and I noticed that one of the comments on the chat was that somebody said, well, how do we distinguish people who are actually residents of a place from people who are just passing through, which in the third world means, in an emerging city like Delhi, means millions of people who are migrants into a city and have no place to live when they first get there, or there's no room for them. That's a very different kind of question than how we deal with people who are in the US on the streets because they have, because that's the only place they can be. And it seems to me I mean, what you see in a place like Delhi or in Rio is that people are coming and going, and that homelessness is not a fate for people in the same way that it becomes a fate for people in the US. And that's where the issue of dignity, I think, comes into this. A lot of the people we work with who are pavement dwellers aren't too upset by it, because they're dwelling on the pavement for a couple of months and then they're going back to their villages. That's not possible in the US. That homelessness becomes a fate, and as Binyamin was saying, what starts as an economic displacement becomes something that is much graver and deeper psychologically. I have a question for the others, which I don't know the answer to, which is, when you speak about the homeless, you're speaking about individuals or families? Because usually the homeless that we're talking about in places like Rio or Delhi are families who have no place to live. It's very, my impression is that in the US, the people who are losing their homes are families, but that the people who are a long time on the street have become more individualized, that families reconfigure, children are passed to other relatives and so on. And I think it really makes quite a difference who the homeless are, about what kind of the feelings of despair that they have or loss of dignity. So I don't know if somebody, do you know that, Michael? Your designs look like they're for families.
No. I mean, the homeless drop-in center we did 20 years ago actually had it had an area for families, and this was basically, they happened to be 32 beds, which would give people an opportunity to sleep in a clean bed. It was not a shelter, so it was separated women and or families. My sense, but I don't know, is that it's the main problem in Los Angeles on the streets is not families, but I can't vouch for that.
That's right, as a matter of statistics. Yeah, I mean, the primary population that lives on the streets is single adults. There's actually a difference between New York and Los Angeles as well. Family homelessness is a larger percentage of New York's overall homeless population than it is in Los Angeles, for whatever reason, but the distinction is quite, it's large. And it's also the case that cities tend to prioritize resources for homeless families, and so they get help quicker, and they get more help, and they're able to transition out of homelessness more easily.
I see.
We're getting a few questions that, and I think, Binyamin, you just answered that, but a lot of people are asking, why is it single men, and why is that the main problem? But I think possibly I can add to that. A large majority of the folks who are houseless and or in unstable housing, houseless or in unstable housing and not sustainable housing, are low-income Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. And I think that there are a lot of overlapping oppressions and that people are facing when they're living outside. And it's a lot of folks who have a lot of disabilities, and there's a huge racialized component to houselessness across the country. So how does race play into our fight for establishing housing as a human right? And what is our responsibility as advocates, architects, scholars, to highlight the racialized the racialized nature of houselessness, and also the overlapping oppressions that people face when they're living outside?
Is that a question?
Yes. How
do we recognize?
Yeah, and how does that play into your advocacy, and what do you feel like is your responsibility as an advocate to highlight?
Yeah, well, I mean, in my work, of course, I work at the global level, but in every city I've ever gone to, whether it's in the US or elsewhere, it's always the most already disadvantaged groups that are falling into homelessness, or extreme housing precarity, or living in informal settlements, as Richard was talking about. And so, of course, it's essential that that I identify who those groups are, because that determines how we respond to making structural change so that those communities don't fall into homelessness. So to me, it's just essential, but of course has to be part of my work. But I'm not a researcher in that way. I mean, I'm an advocate. So, but of course I have to do research in order to advocate. So. But I just wanted to also say about this, people are saying in the chat, why single men and et cetera. You also have to realize that what it means for a woman or a single mother to end up on the streets. I mean, the violence that women experience, not that men don't, but the violence and the sexualized violence women experience on the streets, women know this and will do anything they can to not be on the streets. And if they have children, their children will be removed from them if they're on the streets in many countries around the world. And so they will do everything they can to not end up on the streets. And in some places there are provisions so that women with children don't end up on the streets for those very reasons. But just to clarify that.
Does anybody else have any follow up to Leilani or points about our responsibility to uplift? We also have a few folks talking in the chat about the want to uplift folks' voices and experiences, and it also goes back to what Leilani was saying before, that people are the experts in their own experiences, and a lot of the times when we're advocating or writing and whatnot, we aren't giving the opportunity for people to tell their own stories and be the expert in their own experience and talk about that and highlight that and have a seat at the table to talk about their point of views and perspectives and what they want. So I think it also comes down to that. And maybe Binyamin, you probably have great perspective as you have talked with a lot of folks and do an amazing job of bringing people's experiences to the forefront and translating that to the larger society in a way that is super impactful. So I don't know if you have more to say about that.
I mean, I guess perhaps I'll just add, that homelessness is it's the last resort, right? And so what you see basically when you talk to people who've ended up homeless is that there are lots of people who can't afford housing, and many of them are able to remain in housing through some kind of arrangement. Perhaps family or friends take them in, perhaps they're able to rely on a charity to help them. And the people who are least likely to find any of those safety nets underneath them tend to be Black men, ultimately. And those men also tend to be, the most likely to have had, difficult upbringings, to have been in foster care, to have been imprisoned at some point, and therefore to be less able to find a job. And so there's sort of this compounding effect of all of the injustices, all of the patterns of injustice in our society. And so, I've had the experience of interviewing men who are homeless, and it's like listening to someone for whom at every moment of decision, things went wrong, right? It's just a cascading failure. It's like watching a system break down, not in one point, but again and again and again. And so at every moment when society might have lifted them up, it failed to do that. And so they didn't get the education they need. They didn't get the support that they needed as a young person. They didn't have the opportunities to build their own life or to become self-sufficient. They weren't supported when they fell into substance abuse or whatever it is. It's just this cascade of failures, and the end result of all of those failures and of the fact that our society at the end of the day is least interested in helping Black men when they are down on their luck, is that's who is most likely to end up on the street. And the final thing I'll say about it is that we're used to seeing Black men on the street. We grow accustomed to it. It doesn't bother us in the same way that seeing a woman with a child on the street does. And so there's an acceptability to homelessness that really, is a part of the problem. We're willing to tolerate that in a way that we're not willing to tolerate family homelessness.
Yeah. And I think there's, acceptability or invisibility, hyper invisibility in a way. And there's, I think that there's a powerful aspect to, I think there's this rhetoric that is passed around that if you are if you are housing insecure or living outside, that it is your fault, when really this is the failure of multiple systems on multiple different levels for a lot of different things. And you're blamed so severely for ending up there when, as Leilani said, this is the government that is supposed to be providing services. We need to stop looking at it as if it's people's fault that there's no support or safety net or anything out there, and that we don't see it as our responsibility to provide that type of support. And I think Michael, I don't know if you want to respond to some of the things that we were saying, but I also know in your talk and in your slides and the way that you talk about your ethos and your design and what you put into your work is really bringing a lot of that human dignity back in and giving that respite to folks. But I don't know, I'll pass it to you.
Well, I think, as architects, I mean, we deal with place, and, one of the essences of place is territoriality. And every human being, I mean, just think about if you work in an office and someone messes with your desk, how challenging it is. Or, in our drop-in center, I remember I went down there once and I sat in a chair and a guy came up to me and almost beat the crap out of me because that was his chair. That was his territory. And everybody has a baseline need. The basis of human respect is I respect your place. I respect you. I acknowledge you. That without that basic human respect, looking into someone's face and actually listening to them. I mean, the privilege of some of the work that we do is you actually meet people and you realize, oh, these are my sisters and brothers. These are fellow human beings. They are no different than me, except that, but for the grace of God, whether it was their race, it was their circumstance, they ended up there. And I'm not sure how we change that line of communication so that we understand that we're all the same in this regard. But I think that the bases of respect, understanding, that's why I said autonomy, agency. You deny any human being agency, whether they're a healthy 40-year-old or an aging 80-year-old who is losing her agency. The sense of diminution, the sense of feeling at risk and being diminished is profound. And so I think how we communicate with these people, how we respect them, and again, we're fortunate we have the opportunity. I don't know how you institutionalize that, beyond sort of doing the work and working in these communities. The other thing I'll say is that I think that, and Richard referred to as sort of, how do you deal with the people on the street? And of course, in some countries, being on the street temporarily does not have a fundamental indignity to it. In Los Angeles, it remains the largest problem. And the conundrum is, people are worried, well, if you help them on the street, they're going to stay there. And I think part of the way of operating here is we have to embrace contradictions. There are paradoxes, conundra, and contradictions that have to be accepted simultaneously in attempting to solve this problem. It ain't one solution at the exclusion of others.
Well,
I would say to you about that, Michael, that I think, what I found in working in very poor places is that the issue is really invisibility. And it's constructed in a different way than it is in America, because people are visibly present, right? But they're unseen. Right. Nobody in Delhi would say, well, they're sleeping on the pavement because they failed, which is a very American sort of trope about they didn't take care of themselves. But what is the problem is that they're everywhere and invisible. And the problem for us in dealing with Dalits, for instance, or people who used to be called Dalits, is how to make the physical presence of somebody register to people who see through them.
Right.
And that's, I have come to think, as a design, and is a problem that can be actually dealt with by design. For instance, sharing common resources like a medical clinic, Yep. Suddenly you realize, yes, this person is, alike. but it's not moralized. And I think that's the horrible thing about homelessness in America to me, is that it's basically what has been tragedy is made into something that's blameworthy. And we're dealing with another kind of issue, which hasn't that kind of American moralization, but is in a way worse, because you're completely indifferent. I've seen people in literally in gold Mercedes drive through communities of pavement dwellers with no sense that there's any threat. Their windows are closed. They're not there, although they're everywhere. So I think that's maybe one way of framing what we need to do. If we could take the moralization out of this, how do we make people pay attention to people who they treat as invisible or they take for granted? And I think that, as I said, I think that's a design problem, but it's a problem of invisibility.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know, Michael, if you wanted to respond. I do want to say that we are almost out of time. So
sorry.
I want to give it possibly to somebody who might want to respond to that, because I think this is a really powerful note to end on. This sort of idea of invisibility or hyper invisibility, and what is our charge as advocates, as storytellers, as folks who are endeavoring to work on this problem, and maybe either give an anecdote, something that you think will be helpful. I think it takes a lot of great minds and great people to do this work, and it can be scary and it can be hard and it's stressful. It's emotionally taxing, because I think if you're not experiencing these problems, it's really hard to overlook them. And the sets of priorities changes when you're living outside, and the way the world treats you as like a hyper invisible person. You're so visible, you're invisible, and it creates this sort of hyper invisibility or invisibility. So I don't know if anybody wanted to respond to that.
It's another notion in terms of why Black Lives Matter. I mean, just even the notion Black Lives Matter because Black Lives matter, and you can't be oblivious to that. I would say that in terms, I think it to the extent that it is among other things, a serious design problem, it is also where the design enterprise and the spiritual enterprise are one and the same. I mean, this is a matter of the human spirit, of social, of the sensibility of our society, and how do we create how do we morph into something where you actually give a shit about everybody,
Yeah.
and you don't look through people as if they don't exist. That is.
Yeah, we just got I just saw somebody in the chat say, some people who are living outside don't want housing. And for anyone, I used to be a case manager at a homeless prevention site. So I had like 50 or 60 cases. And I think, and this is what I'm saying, we are coming into it from a particular perspective with a particular lived experience. And we're like, absolutely, people are going to want to go straight from this point into a 1-bedroom. And I think this is where it comes in, like humanizing folks and giving people agency and actually listening and talking with communities and listening to what people want and how that works, and providing resources is so important. But I just wanted to highlight someone who said that in the chat, because I think it really plays into us believing that people are the experts in what they need with their life. And if they're saying they don't know, it's not about answering the question for them. It's about providing the resources and opportunities to figure that out, and giving people tools to help do that. But I wanted to highlight that and possibly let Leilani respond.
Yeah, I might jump in. I'm really happy that Richard brought up the issue of invisibility. I think that is the central issue at hand in so many ways. I mean, the ultra visibility and the ultra invisibility, I think, as you said, Denise, and certainly when I've traveled the world, that is the single most powerful thing I think that people living in homelessness say to me, and they will say to me often that I am the first person who's actually given them time to speak, for example, if I'm going into, certain homeless communities, et cetera. We are launching the Global Homelessness Action for that very reason. I was looking around the world during the pandemic, especially, and thinking, where are the places and spaces for people living in homelessness to make their claims, to have their say? They are so few outside of a pandemic and almost obliterated in the midst of a pandemic. And we just wanted to give them a chance to have a space and place to do so. And the pickup and take up was amazing. I mean, these are people who are struggling, to find a place to defecate, let alone do a video for an unknown reason, just to give them that. But it was amazing, the pickup. I want to actually pivot, if you don't mind, and just say something about the role of architects, or possible role of architects in design in all of this. I'm really loving what Michael has been saying, and I need to follow you more, Michael. I don't know you, but I have spent a little bit of time in LA, and so I need to get to know you. But I have had some conversations with architects, most recently with Amanda Levitt in the UK, and one of the things that she brought to my attention, which I'd never thought about before, is that architects could play such an amazing role in all of this, not just from a design point of view, but because of the process of architecture, that you're in touch with people who do zoning, you are in touch with government officials, you need to be in touch with the people on the ground, and that you already have, as part of your processes, quite an interesting multi-stakeholder approach. And so that could really be harnessed. I talked to some of the folks involved in the High Line in New York. In fact, one of the kind of founders of the idea of the High Line, and he had been quoted in an architectural magazine saying, and I really thought this was so amazing. He said, the High Line is not a success. The High Line is a failure. And he said, it's a failure because we asked the wrong question. We said, what could we do with these railway lands, rather than what does the community need? And then as a result, you end up with the High Line with all these, beautifully designed, architecturally designed buildings. And so then that led me to ask this question, and I put this out there for all the architects out there. What is your social responsibility? Do you have a social responsibility when given an opportunity to play a role in developing along something like the High Line? Do you have a responsibility to ask that question that hadn't been asked, which is, does the community need this beautifully designed building that's each unit's going to be 30 million US, or does the community need something else?
You do have the obligation to ask and challenge. I mean, the specifics, if you're commissioned to do a building on the High Lines, I don't know if the answer is, well, I'm not going to do it. But we are in a position to think, spatially and programmatically outside of the box. How do you engage everyone? And I know in our work, we've done, houses for very, very rich people, as well as for the projects for the homeless. It's the same human act, space, territoriality, ownership, these are human, this relates to being human, whether it's a 300 square foot unit or a 10,000 square foot home. It is the same human act and requires the same empathy and love, and actually love. I'm noticing one of the chats, the question of we refer to them as the institutionally resistant folks who say we want to be on the street, and the chat was saying, these people are on the street because they're tired of being judged. They're tired of being invisible. Not that they don't want housing, but they want it with dignity and respect. It really comes down to, like with every human being, dignity, respect. And I don't know, go out and talk to one of your sisters in on the streets and say, oh my God, we are really all in this together.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. Thank you, Michael, Binyamin, Richard, Leilani. I do have to end the panel now, but I've really enjoyed speaking with everyone. And I feel like I learned a lot. I have a lot more questions. I would love to dig into a lot more stuff with all of you, but maybe sometime in the future it will happen. And I guess all I will say is I appreciate everyone's work. It's not easy and it's hard, and I hope we keep pushing to uplift the voices of the people that we care so deeply about, and the communities that we care deeply about, who need more advocates like you all, and who need more folks who are not scared to go and address the hard points, and are not scared to be uncomfortable, and are not scared to say, wow, we're really messing this up. How can we do better? And let's stick it to the systems that have been keeping communities down for hundreds of years now. And with that, I'll turn it over to Alice.
Thanks, Denise. Greetings, everyone. I'm Alice Kimm, co-curator along with John Friedman of this event, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to session 2, which we hope will piggyback on the discussion we just heard. We titled session 2 Policy, What's the Problem?, to highlight the fact that meaningful action to prevent and then end homelessness can only happen with progressive policy that supports nimble follow-through of effective initiatives, and by extension, when it applies, again, as we've just heard, good design that promotes healthy and equitable cities. So how can we give government a hard shove? How do we change the national will and reverse this entrenched indifference that Mr. Appelbaum referred to? We do have the resource in this country. We know that. What can we do? So we're going to start with a short keynote and a moderated Q&A with one of our guests, followed by a moderated panel with 4 additional experts who've graciously joined us today. But I'm going to introduce now our moderator, Samuel Greenberg, who will introduce everyone else and lead this session. So Sam, while a student at Harvard College just a short time ago, co-founded Y2Y Network, an inspiring organization that partners with students, grassroots organizations, and homeless youths to interrupt the homelessness cycle for a generation of young adults. A few years ago, the network opened Y2Y Harvard Square, the country's first student-run homeless shelter that supports this group. And in 2 weeks, this is very exciting, Y2Y will break ground on a 13,000 square foot transformation of an existing community building in New Haven, Connecticut. Sam actually wrote his undergraduate thesis on homelessness, focusing specifically on policy. So he really does bring special expertise, passion, action, and also compassion to the job of moderating this session today. So I just want to welcome all of our speakers and welcome Sam. And Sam, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Alice. It's an honor to be here, and it's a privilege to get to introduce our next keynote speaker. Shaun Donovan is a candidate for New York City mayor. He was born and grew up in New York City and holds a BA and master's degrees in public administration and architecture from Harvard University. As an undergrad, he volunteered at the Harvard Square Homeless Shelter, the nation's first student-run homeless shelter, and held roles early in his career at the National Coalition for the Homeless and the New York-based Community Preservation Corporation. Donovan served as commissioner of the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development in senior roles at HUD and FHA under President Clinton. Shaun Donovan served as the 15th Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and the 40th Director of the Office of Management and Budget in President Obama's cabinet. His work reduced inequality, expanded healthcare, improved education, and fought climate change. He is a trustee of the Urban Institute and serves on the advisory board of Opportunity Insights. Donovan is currently working with residents and community organizations to deliver restaurant meals to families affected by COVID, revitalize public housing, and to ensure that every New Yorker is counted in the 2020 census. It's wonderful to have you here. Welcome, Secretary Donovan.
You and I want to thank Peter Coombs, who invited me to join this. And I particularly want to thank you, Sam. Just like you, although not so recently, I was a volunteer at the Harvard Square Homeless Shelter. In fact, I started in 1983, the year it opened. So dating myself here. But I think the other thing I want to say to you that is particularly powerful for me, I see that you've written about how the power of stories and your emotional connection to the homeless really began at Harvard. And the same is true for me. I was actually teaching in Robert Cole's class, the book Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. And I was walking through Harvard Square and, like so many of us, lost in my thoughts and stopped short and realized that I had just walked past an elderly African-American man sitting on a milk crate. And he was holding a picture of himself 30 years before in uniform. And I said to myself, here is the invisible man. Here is someone who, in order to get our attention as a human being, has to hold a photograph of himself rather than us being able to see him for who he is today. And that invisibility to me is at the core of the problem of why we can't solve homelessness. Because the truth is, and if there's one thing I want you to remember from this discussion today, homelessness is a solvable problem. I know that because when I led housing and homelessness for President Obama, Michelle Obama and I challenged mayors across the country to end veteran homelessness. And in fact, 80 cities and states ended, not reduced, ended veteran homelessness. In fact, a number of them ended chronic homelessness as well. So fundamentally, what I believe is that if we are going to do that, we have to have the capacity. And as you heard, I was a designer, studied architecture at Harvard, worked as an architect for a few years. Architects have the power to reimagine and see solutions that no one else has seen. That is what design is. It's imagining things no one's seen before. And we need to reimagine shelter and the right to shelter that we have in New York City as a right to housing. Fundamentally, we need that commitment. But I think there are three fundamental problems that have stopped us from getting there: a moral problem, a funding problem, and a leadership problem. What do I mean by a moral problem? Well, let me tell you about my first meeting that I had when I was housing secretary. I went to see the veteran secretary, Eric Shinseki, to explain to him what we call housing first. And I spent a few minutes doing this, and then he turned to me and said, well, let me get this straight. So you're telling me we have to take our most precious resource that we have, very expensive housing with services, and give it to folks who are still actively using drugs or actively drinking? And I said, yes. And I think too often what we say, and the best example or explanation of this is, I think, Malcolm Gladwell's $1 Million Murray that he published about a decade ago in The New Yorker, is that too often we believe this is a problem where if a homeless person just had enough will, if they do well enough in their rehab program, then we'll give them a housing unit. We have it completely backwards. We have to start with housing. And because you cannot solve the other challenges of homelessness without housing first. So it's a moral problem. It's a funding problem. But again, we actually have it backwards. Because the truth is that when somebody sleeps on the streets or in a shelter, it is not only the moral cost and the human cost is enormous, but the fiscal cost, as a former budget director, is actually enormous too. Why? Because when someone sleeps on a street, where do they get their health care? In the emergency room. They cycle in and out of institutional settings that are dramatically more expensive than actually housing them. And we have the data to prove this, but it's a wrong pocket problem. And that leads to the leadership problem from my perspective. We have way too many mayors, way too many public officials that think we're going to solve homelessness with homeless programs. And the only way to solve homelessness is to bring every single solution: healthcare, jobs, education, all the various pieces together. That's what we did under the Obama administration that allowed us to make so much progress. So let me end there because I want to get to questions. But I am, as you said, running for mayor. I would love to have your engagement and support on this campaign because we can end homelessness in New York City. Go to Shaun for NYC and learn more about what we're doing. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you so much for those moving words, Secretary Donovan. And you preempted me. I was also a volunteer at the Harvard Square Homeless Shelter as an undergraduate, which for me was a transformative experience. And really, I think, in addition to the introduction that Alice generously gave me, was absolutely transformative to the way I see homelessness and the work. You actually were kind enough to, in 2013, as HUD Secretary, come and commemorate the Harvard Square Homeless Shelter's 30th anniversary. And not to sort of fanboy too much, but my classmates and I absolutely idolized you, and I can say that that kind of fandom has continued. For generations of students who are grappling with the deep injustice of homelessness, often for the first time. You were and you are a profound inspiration for how to work every day toward ending homelessness, while critically, and I can't say it better than you said, never losing sight of the humanity of each and every person who experiences homelessness in this country. I think it's fair to say that among the 500 or so people watching now, there are people who you've inspired in this room, virtual room, and I guess you just alluded to this. You've filed to open a committee to explore a run for mayor. You're running for mayor. After everything you've done in your career in public service, can you tell us, why are you embarking on a potential run for mayor?
Well, it's really two things for me, Sam. One is that I grew up in New York City at a different time of crisis. Not only was homelessness exploding on our streets, but literally neighborhoods like the South Bronx and other communities of color were crumbling, were burning to the ground. And in addition to my work at the National Coalition for the Homeless, I came back to New York, started working at a nonprofit in the Bronx to rebuild those same neighborhoods. And to see my city in deep, deep pain, to see more homeless people sleeping on the streets and in shelters now than even when I was a kid, at any time since the Great Depression, in fact, it is completely unacceptable that we don't have the leadership and the ability to move forward. I will say the other thing that profoundly affected me, I've been a public servant all of my life. I've never been an elected official. But I was standing on the Truman balcony the last night of the Obama administration, literally the spot where Donald Trump came back from Walter Reed Hospital and ripped off his mask. And I was standing there with the Obamas the night before Trump's inauguration. And I think, like all of us, I had to look in the mirror and say, how can this be in our country, that we have a leader like this? How can we be this divided? How can we be worshiping white nationalism in this country? And looking in the mirror, I decided the thing that I could do was come back to my city and run and try to re-engage in public service in a way that touched the ground profoundly.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That's incredibly inspiring. I think it's safe, maybe the understatement of all understatements is that this is a profoundly dispiriting time. I know for those of us who work in homelessness, it's been exhausting. And of course, it's though we've obviously, there's some positive sense both in the coronavirus and in the election of things changing. I think it's safe to say that for those who are experiencing homelessness, it's maybe never been more dangerous. And certainly for those of us who are working on the issue, I can just say I'm exhausted. I think we probably all are. If you were to talk to 20-year-old Tim, I guess 28-year-old Tim too, but 20-year-old Tim or a college student, somebody who's grappling with these issues of homelessness today, what would you say? What would you say about this moment and why it's worth getting involved anyway?
Well, look, something President Obama used to say to us all the time in crisis. And look, I've seen my fair share of crisis. I was housing commissioner after 9/11 in New York. I was housing secretary in the midst of the worst housing crisis of our lifetimes. President Obama asked me to lead the recovery, all the federal recovery efforts after Sandy hit my hometown. And as if no good deed goes unpunished, 3 weeks after becoming budget director, Ebola emerged. And I ended up in the situation room with Dr. Fauci and the president and vice president, with all our military leaders, trying to make sure Ebola didn't become a global pandemic. And I've seen this over and over again. What President Obama used to say is never let a crisis go to waste. And what I think that means really is two things. One is that when we experience tragedy, when we watch our community wiped out, when we lose neighbors and friends and loved ones to a pandemic, the pain also allows us to see the world in new ways. And in those moments of seeing the world in new ways, it is a moment that we can actually reimagine. And think about the killing of George Floyd, the protests in our streets, the power of this movement that we've seen over the summer. Those are the makings of reimagining many things. And on homelessness in particular, I want to take a specific example, because finding the opportunities in moments of crisis is part of what I think architects and designers must do, and also public servants have to do. We now have homeless folks in hotels across the country because of this pandemic. And the deep tragedy would be that we have folks who are now actually being housed, that were on the streets or in mass shelters, forcing them as the pandemic ends to go back into shelter or back to the streets. So my question would be, why not demand that we use capital investment from the funding that's going to come for the stimulus in the pandemic to actually buy up hotels, buy up commercial buildings that are empty, turn them into supportive housing, take shelters, accelerate the change into supportive housing. This is a moment when we all should be waking up and saying it's not okay for them to be thrown out of these hotels. And in fact, I was protesting on the Upper West Side with residents of a hotel. Some West Siders are saying, well, homeless don't belong in our neighborhood. We want this hotel back. I think the opposite. Why shouldn't we be turning this hotel into permanent supportive housing? And so to me, that's a very specific example where we could not let this crisis go to waste and use this moment to accelerate exactly what we know the solution is, which is supportive housing.
Thank you. And I think one thing that you were just talking about that resonates with me so deeply is this notion of, in some ways, it's been amazing to see the kinds of solutions that we've come up with to keep folks safe during COVID. I know I'm based here in New Haven, Connecticut right now, and we've, lots of folks to decongregate shelters were put in hotels. But the idea that, I think yesterday was the highest death total we've seen in the nation from COVID yet, and the idea that these programs are winding down now, rather than, as you just said, being made maybe permanent, seems unconscionable. And so that's something that's been on my mind so heavily, and I really appreciate you raising that. We're down to our last minute or so. How can people learn more about your campaign, and are there any final thoughts you want to leave the room with?
Shaun for NYC. SHAUN, I spell it the wrong way for many people. So please come. We have over 200 people working on policy for the campaign, volunteering. We're going to have an aggressive homeless policy, as you've heard, reimagining the right to shelter as a right to housing in New York City, and would love your help and support to be able to win. But I guess this is the thing I would leave with, is a call to arms for architects and designers. And I think the last panel, Michael and others were talking about this. And I take that very personally. As an architecture student at the GSD in the 1990s, I felt too often architecture was a luxury good. And in fact, the power of architecture is that designers can imagine things that no one has ever seen before. And in particular, I think we've come an enormous distance since I was in architecture school in ways that truly community-oriented design can be put in place. If architects have the right training, the right approach, they can engage with community members to make sure that the expertise that designers bring isn't imposed onto the will of the community, but is in service of the will of the community and the vision of the community. And for me, that is what architects need to be doing. They need to be social entrepreneurs. They need to be community visionaries. And we have the tools to do that. And I think this is a moment, again, in crisis, where as we're thinking about our cities, the way we design our cities, we're thinking about how to open up our streets and change the way we inhabit our streets and our cities. this is a moment where architects can play a particularly powerful role. So go get them. And Sam, thank you for your inspiration. The issue of youth homelessness is a hugely important one, and you've really moved that conversation and the set of solutions to a new place. So thank you. I'm a big fan of yours as well. So
you've definitely made my day. Fair to say. Thank you so much, Secretary Donovan, for those moving words and for the inspiration you've provided to me and so many others. The point you made about the call to action for architects really resonates for me. Just I guess it was a year ago now, before sort of COVID hit, we had the amazing opportunity to have a group of youth with lived experience of homelessness in our architect studio here in New Haven, literally laying out the design for our new proposed site. And I think it's maybe obvious to say, but the insights that we've gotten from being able to benefit from the expertise of youth with lived experience has been totally transformative. And if our designs are good, it's because of that. It's because of expertise and because of our architects who have been skilled and willing to take that in and take that. So thank you for saying that. Thank you for lifting up this group of people with your words. And again, thank you for the inspiration that you've provided to me and a generation of people working at the Harvard Square Homeless Shelter and for joining us today.
Totally my pleasure. Big elbow bump to you, Sam, and to everybody who's watching.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and transition now to our panel 2, and I have the honor of introducing an incredibly thoughtful, creative, and dynamic group of panelists who are going to talk to us about homelessness politics and policy. This is an incredible opportunity, I think, for us to hear from panelists who will talk about how we can really work toward a vision of a world where everyone has a home using policy. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first panelist to really kick us off. Our first panelist is Nithiya Raman. Nithiya is council member elect to LA City Council District 4 and will be seated, actually, I think within 11 days after running a historic 15-month volunteer-powered campaign. Nithiya is an urban planner with a master's degree from MIT, and I'll be honest, reading her housing and homelessness policy platform is some of the most fun I've had in months, which I guess may say more about me than her, but among a myriad of creative solutions, her platform talks about expanding access centers across Los Angeles to serve people experiencing homelessness, robust eviction prevention policy, zoning reform to make affordable housing development by right, and removing density limits and parking requirements to incentivize affordable housing development. Nithiya has founded separate nonprofit organizations in India and Los Angeles focused on urban poverty and homelessness. Nithiya lives in Silver Lake, Los Angeles with her husband and twin preschoolers. Welcome, Nithiya Raman.
Well, thank you so much for having me today. And even though physically we can't be together, it's an honor to be back in the Cambridge virtual space, having grown up in a suburb of Boston and having spent so much time in this city as a student. I'm really grateful to be here and honored to share this space with so many incredible thinkers on these issues. As Sam said, I am a recently elected government official, and I haven't even taken office yet. But what I wanted to really highlight in this particular moment, in discussing the kinds of policies that are possible, is that in Los Angeles, which has some of the most acute issues related to housing and homelessness in America, we are at a moment of real change. And I wanted to just talk about two aspects of that change, because I think it sets some useful context for any discussions we may have about specific policies. One is that our context around homelessness in the city of Los Angeles has really transformed in the last few years. So 5 years ago, or actually even longer ago, 6 years ago, when I worked at City Hall briefly, I wrote a report about homelessness, talking about how the city was spending its money on homelessness. And through that work that I did in the report, I looked at homelessness across the city. I talked to every city department that interacted with homelessness. I talked to a number of the nonprofits and larger agencies that dealt with homelessness in the city and that were housed in the county. And the situation was actually very, very different then. When I was writing that report and I was talking about the issue of homelessness, it was not as big of an issue in Los Angeles in the public consciousness as it is today, because the very shape of homelessness was different then. For many years in Los Angeles, homelessness was really concentrated in a handful of neighborhoods, primarily in the Skid Row neighborhood, in downtown, but in smaller numbers in the Hollywood neighborhood and at the beaches. And in other neighborhoods across the city, homelessness was not as visible of an issue, even though it was housing insecurity and homelessness is a problem that has shaped Los Angeles for a very, very long time. Since then, there has been a growth in visible tent encampments across the entire city in every neighborhood across Los Angeles. And because of that growth, it's become an issue that's really, I think, transformed public discussions. It has become the most important issue in Los Angeles for so many residents, along with its partner, which is housing insecurity and rising rents. And so this has really transformed the context in which elected representatives are also working. When President Obama and Michelle Obama worked with all of these cities to try and end veteran homelessness, they were trying to bring an issue to the forefront that in Los Angeles needs no push to be at the forefront. The second piece is that our elections at the local level have really changed. And this was something that had a big impact on my own election, which is that for a long time in Los Angeles, very few people voted in municipal elections. And the people who voted in municipal elections were not really representative of the wider Los Angeles population. In many ways, they were wealthier, they were more likely to be homeowners, they were not as representative of the diversity of the city of Los Angeles because our municipal elections happened in off years. In this election cycle, for the first time, our local elections and our federal elections overlapped. And so a lot of the voter turnout that marked our presidential election also was reflected in down ballot races, including mine, combined with what I'm very proud of in our campaign, which was an incredible get out the vote effort, which means that in a district of 250,000 with 180,000 registered voters, voter turnout in the general election for the city council seat went from 24,000 to 130,000, which is a massive increase. And in a district where the majority of voters are renters, where a lot more voters are facing housing insecurity, are facing real pressures in terms of paying for their rents, that means that there is more electoral pressure to address not just homelessness directly, but the causes of homelessness. Rising rents, the lack of eviction protections, the lack of access to things like a lawyer when you're facing eviction or to emergency rental assistance, which can stop the flood and growth of people who are experiencing homelessness, many of whom are homeless for the first time, and also increase support for things like affordable housing and homelessness resources in every neighborhood across the city. And I think that's what was reflected in this most recent elections. So that's what I wanted to highlight in these initial remarks, which is that as we are talking about policies, at least in the city of Los Angeles, we're talking about those policies in a markedly changed context. And I'm excited to have those continued policy discussions in that context.
Thank you so much, Nithiya, for those remarks, and congratulations on that win. It's really inspiring to hear your perspective specifically about how it's horrifying to hear about the sort of rise of street homelessness, but it's powerful and inspiring to hear that is something that can actually change public consciousness toward action. And I'm excited to get into that when we get to the discussion part of our conversation. I'm going to switch now to our next panelist, Angela Howard, who works on an issue very close to my heart, youth and young adult homelessness. Angela is Senior Vice President for Real Estate and Facilities at Covenant House International, an organization providing services to youth experiencing homelessness. Angela has over 30 years of experience in the field of real estate and construction management, including as Managing Director of the Culture, Health, and Education practice of Jonathan Rose Companies. She has worked with public sector and nonprofit entities to strategically plan, program, design, finance, construct, and manage civic, cultural, institutional, and educational facilities. Angela serves as a founding board member of Academy of the City Charter School, is a board member at WIN NYC and TAWA, Tanzania, education advisor to the 14 Plus Foundation, and is also a parish council member at St. Augustine's RC Church in Park Slope, New York. Welcome, Angela Howard.
Thank you. It's nice to see everyone. Since we've got a global audience, I greet everyone in a way that's agnostic to time zone. So I won't say good morning, good afternoon, or good day. Covenant House is an organization that supports 31 homeless youth shelters throughout the Americas, with our shelters in the United States, Central America, and Canada. We cobble together largely private donations and disparate sources of public funding in order to achieve this. And I wanted to start off with some data. So in the course of a given year, 1 in 10 young people experience homelessness. That's 3.5 million. In that same year, 1 in 30 adolescent minors may experience homelessness, and that's 700,000. So that leaves us with 4.2 million young people in a given year in both urban and rural settings that are experiencing homelessness. Here are some of the risk factors. Youth lacking a high school diploma or a GED have a 340% higher risk of homelessness than do young people who have completed high school. Youth in households making under $24,000 a year have a 162% higher risk. And we have unmarried parenting youth having a 200% higher risk of homelessness. LGBTQ youth are at more than double the risk of homelessness than their non-LGBTQ peers and have over twice the rate of early death among all youth experiencing homelessness. And in a final note that's not on the slide, many of our youth have been affected by trafficking. So what can we do from a design point of view? And I think I want to talk, policy, ethics, and action. I want to talk about action. First and foremost, we incorporate some of the tenets of trauma-informed care design into our shelters by recognizing the humanity of our youth and by creating spaces that they can feel at home. We employ a design methodology that's sensitive to their needs and serves as a healing balm to them. So I'm going to present to you some ideas around Covenant House's Vancouver facility, newly designed by NSDA architects. Our shelter provides a beacon for our youth. We supply emergency short stay shelter as well as assistance to more stable forms of housing. We also run programs such as rites of passage and moms and babies programs for youth who request longer stays. We generally look to provide our youth with a place to rest their heads comfortably at night, not in a ward style setting, but in a space that they can relax into. We provide nourishing meals and a place to gather with their friends and peers. We attempt to address educational deficiencies by encouraging further education, GED, certificate classes, providing classrooms, and we partner with potential employers to match our youth with job training programs. We create safe spaces. Homelessness in youth often looks different from adult or family homelessness. Couch surfing is a theme, and that young person with a backpack that you see on the street may not have a place to rest their heads. Youth fall through the cracks and require a more particular kind of service to assist them in getting back on the track of their lives. Mental health counseling, an FQHC, art classes, music classes, space where they can be themselves. This is the least we can do as a society for our youth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela, for those remarks. And I think, two things I wanted to uplift from what you said. One is just, I'm so grateful that you brought up the disproportionality of LGBTQ plus youth as part of the youth homelessness population. Transgender Day of Remembrance was just a couple of weeks ago, and it's just the levels of sort of intersectional oppression that young people who identify as LGBTQ face has been a huge, I think, hugely underreported issue. And so I appreciate you lifting it up. And then also, of course, your focus on trauma-informed design. I know that we're able to take some of those learnings as well to our work, and just noticed how much it mattered that when young people came into a space that felt good, maybe it's obvious, and for the architects on this Zoom, it won't be a surprise, but just the impact that makes. So I appreciate you lifting both of those things up. I'm going to transition to our third speaker today, Hanan Scrapper. Hanan told me that she didn't necessarily plan to end up working in homelessness, but that the field chose her. Hanan is the regional director of PATH San Diego. At PATH, which stands for People Assisting the Homeless, She leads a team of over 100 employees, working toward a vision of a world where everyone has a home. Driven by the desire to help others and the community, Hanan has extensive experience in helping our most vulnerable populations overcome extreme adversities caused by homelessness, domestic violence, political torture, and human trafficking. Previously, she worked as program director at Veterans Villages of San Diego, leading both their supportive services for veteran families and veterans homelessness prevention demonstration programs. Welcome, Hanan Scrapper.
Thank you, Sam. This is really exciting. Thanks for having me. We have such a great panel discussion, so I'm looking forward to it. As Sam mentioned, I'm Hanan Scrapper, Regional Director for PATH San Diego. So PATH is a statewide organization, and we've been around for about 37 years. Across the state, we help individuals experiencing homelessness find permanent, stable housing through intensive case management services, medical, mental health care needs, benefit advocacy, employment, and any other services that are deemed appropriate for the individual or interest in the individual in helping them make it home. Our mission is to end homelessness for individuals, families, and communities. And we envision a world where everyone makes it home and is stable in their living environment. So this is a statewide snapshot of PATH. PATH stands for People Assisting the Homeless. It began, as I mentioned, 37 years ago in an emergency shelter in West Los Angeles. Since then, 10 years ago, we transitioned to a Housing First organization, meaning all of our services that we offer throughout the state is really using a Housing First approach and model. Currently, we serve over 140 cities in 6 different regions. We're in San Diego, Santa Barbara, San Jose, Sacramento, and Orange County as well. We are approaching nearly 900 employees throughout the state, and we have about 1,700 interim shelter beds. And our shelters are focused around serving individuals who are experiencing, high barriers and making sure that access to shelter is without any preconditions, and making sure that we provide immediate access with low barrier and low demand services. We have PATH Ventures, which is our development arm developing affordable housing throughout the state. We have about 1,300 supportive housing units in 21 developments. On average, PATH helps 23 individuals make it home a week throughout our programs. So our service delivery model really focuses around person-centered care. You have the individual in the center, and we focus around income, mental health, support systems, legal issues, anything that is contributing to the individual's homelessness, and looking at ways to eliminate that and help them make it home. We look at provider-client relationship, which is really driven by how do we make sure we meet the needs of the individual we're serving. Programmatic flexibility, meaning that we're going to come to you and meet you where you are so that we can offer services to you, as opposed to expecting you to walk through our doors and taking services to them. Systemic barriers, working through to navigate the systems and helping folks really address barriers that are related to systemic issues, and cultural barriers, racial barriers that we're really focusing on now, like how does this systemic racism impact our clients, as well as racist policies that we have in place, and looking at contextual barriers as well. We really look at also the biological, psychological, and sociological impact that it has on the individual that makes the individual stay in homeless cycle for a long time, and making sure that we're addressing the barriers that are created around that with the person in the center. So in thinking about policy and the barriers we experience when we talk about ending homelessness is, lack of sustainable housing, along with lack of sustainable funding. As a nonprofit, year to year, we're consistently working on how do we ensure we have stable funding to continue to offer services. And then building more affordable housing units. It costs more to build more affordable units versus market rate facilities or units. And then redlining. Our permanent supportive housing developments are still being built in impoverished communities, historically used to be redline communities. So how do we look at diversifying that and making sure we're building units across various communities? We're also placing, this is specific to San Diego, we're placing high percentage of our clients in communities that are considered declining, hazardous, and industrial. For San Diego, as we place people in permanent housing, we've noticed that 90% of the units are in those communities. And, 5% of the general population in San Diego are Black and African Americans, but make up the 21% of unsheltered and 30% unsheltered homeless population. And then our current homelessness response system, it prioritizes white individuals at a higher rate than BIPOC individuals due to our common assessment tool not factoring in the racial trauma that goes into it. And thank you. That's it for my presentation.
Thank you so much, Hanan, for that excellent presentation. And I really appreciate you lifting up specifically your work and thinking about how race and racism is inextricable from homelessness. And we're going to dive into that in the discussion. So thank you so much for that really compelling and thoughtful presentation and for the work you do. Last, but certainly not least, is Heidi Marston for our speaker today. Heidi was selected as the Executive Director of the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, or LAHSA, in June 2020, after serving as the Interim Executive Director since January. In this role, she is entrusted to serve as a leader in the effort to reduce homelessness across Greater Los Angeles. Heidi also sits on the Leadership Council for the National Alliance on Homelessness. Heidi joined LAHSA in February 2019 as Chief Program Officer, after serving at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs in several roles, including Director of Community Engagement and Reintegration Services and Special Assistant to the VA Secretary under President Obama. Welcome, Heidi Marston.
Hi, thank you so much, and really great to be here. I have a couple slides I want to show. I have more than what we'll have time to get through, so I will make it available for folks to look at after. But just for folks who aren't aware, LAHSA, as was mentioned, is a joint powers authority. So we are the entity for the city and the county of Los Angeles that is charged with overseeing our community's response to the crisis. So we administer funding and really drive the reform of the system. Just to put this in scope and scale, we know that about 568,000 people are experiencing homelessness across the country. About 151,000 of those are in California. 66,000 are in LA County. Of those 66,000, as Nithiya was mentioning earlier, close to 40,000 are unsheltered, which makes homelessness really unique here in LA and a very visible crisis. There are a number of issues that drive people into homelessness, and I've been so happy today to hear the conversation and focusing on those upstream factors. I'll talk more about this, but the one thing I do want to say here is we know that LA, from a housing perspective, needs at least 509,000 new affordable units. And that's just to maintain the current crisis, not the wave that's coming. And it also goes without saying that systemic and institutional racism disproportionately drives people of color into homelessness. In LA County, 8% of the population is Black African American, and 34% of the homeless population is Black African American. So there's a major misrepresentation there. And then finally, when we talk about inflow and scale, again, to put it into perspective, last year, our housing system rehoused 207 people every single day. Every single day, 227 people fell into homelessness. So again, thinking about the policies, thinking about what we're doing that's driving this inequality and driving people to these crises is so critical in really addressing it long term. I'm going to talk about a couple really key policy choices. As Shaun Donovan said earlier, I completely agree that homelessness is an issue that can be solved, mostly because we caused it. And there are key policy choices that have been made at the federal, state levels that have driven it, that we need to look at and shine a light on and undo in order to really drive this. And then just for, again, some performance so folks know how our system operates, we last year housed 92,000 people across our interim housing system. 61,000 people, almost 62,000 over the last few years have been permanently housed. And we've touched about an outreach to about 116,000 individuals. So again, the volume of people that we're seeing is significant. The volume of people that we are resolving their unhoused situation is increasing every year, but the number of people who fall in year over year continues to increase. So these are a couple key policy changes I wanted to call out. Happy to talk about it more. But again, stagnant income across the country is a major driver. Welfare reform in 1996 reduced the number of families who are low income who receive cash assistance from 76 to 23%. Additionally, minimum wage federally and across all levels of the state and local government have frozen or not kept pace with cost of living. So in LA County, to put it into perspective, renters in LA County need to make $42 an hour, which is almost 3 times the minimum wage just to make the monthly rent here in LA County of about $2,100. Additionally, I spoke to it earlier, but affordable housing, both the sustainment of affordable housing, maintaining it and preserving it and creating new is a key issue that is acute here in Los Angeles, but is also an issue across the country that comes from Section 8 housing choice voucher programs and comes from the decline in some of the federal grants that are driven to local communities to develop these types of properties and housing. And finally, mass incarceration also being a major driver. We know both state and federal policy changes over the last decades have really impacted and expanded the population of people who are incarcerated, and it disproportionately impacts Black and Latinx communities. So being incarcerated has significant economic impacts and often drives people into disadvantaged economic states. So this type of reform is so needed in looking at the upstream issues that are driving people into our system. So I will stop there. This kind of just gives the overview of policy issues that we can address at the federal and state level, but really look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Heidi, and we will definitely get to some of those. I hope you'll bring up some of those policy opportunities and proposals in our discussion. We're going to go ahead and dive right into our panel discussion. So if I can ask all of our panelists to just please turn on your video, and we will go ahead and get started. I really appreciate that each of you identified the barriers, issues, or policies that are causing homelessness, right? That sort of, when we think about policy, and also to some extent the work that you're doing to address it. I really want to dive into some of those specific issues and how they relate to policy. The first question that I'm going to start with, and Heidi, I'll start with you, but I'd love everybody to respond to this, is, I'm sure I'm not alone when I say that since March and the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think I've been in a bit of a constant state of exhaustion. People doing homelessness work day in and day out have been working on overdrive since the onset of the pandemic. So I just want to say, first of all, that I appreciate the work that all 4 of you have done and are doing. And I'm sure you're exhausted, so I also appreciate you making time today. What is one way that homelessness looks different in your work or your lens into homelessness in the context of the pandemic? And I would love if everybody can share one thing, although I'm sure there are a lot. Heidi, could you get us started?
Sure. I think with homelessness and COVID, it's not unlike anything else where there was a lot of unknown going into it. I will say, I'll take the positive lens. If there is a silver lining of COVID, what it did show us is that when we have a crisis and we are allowed to address homelessness like the crisis that we've known that it is, we can do that through funding alignment, through city, county, federal, and state alignment on what the priorities are. We are able to move and make progress much faster than we ever thought. And we demonstrated that through COVID with efforts here in LA like Project Room Key, where we were able to put nearly 6,000 people into hotel and motel rooms who were experiencing homelessness in a 2-month period. That surprised all of us at how fast we were. But again, it shows the power of what can happen when we all come together to address the crisis as humans, and we put our resources and our will behind it.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I read a lot about that, and it was really inspiring to hear about. Hanan, can you take a stab at this?
Yeah, one thing that obviously is like it's completely different from how we were serving our population to how we're serving moving forward with COVID in mind and looking at preventative mechanisms. And the biggest change is always looking at high-risk populations and assessing and making sure that we are always focused on how do we help you. Earlier, I think we touched on a lot of our homeless population are going to the emergency rooms to get their medical health needs met. And so how do we make sure that when we're working with them that they do have a primary care physician, they are taking care of themselves, physical health, mental health, all of that, while we are still using our protocols to keep our staff safe as well. That's been like a huge focus around the protocols we have in place, and really education around what does COVID-19 actually mean and how does this impact you. So our teams are very much always within that lens of providing education, providing knowledge around like how do we prevent this from happening. And in the event you experience these symptoms, these are the steps to take, because our clients aren't sitting around watching the news. They don't have the most updated information. So we are really their source of information. We have to be able to provide that to them in that immediate, constant way, while we're still working on making sure we're moving them to a permanent housing setting as quickly as we can.
Thank you. Angela, what has COVID meant with Covenant House and the work that you guys do?
Well, I'm going to say Covenant House, but I'm also going to say WIN as well, because one of the things, I say this and I'm going to highlight that one. One of the things that we found very early on at WIN, which is Women in Need, serves families that are homeless, is that there's a huge disparity and inequity around technology for education. So while we had to shift in order to keep our families safe and schools were closed, we had to figure out a way in order to get computers and technology and Wi-Fi and bandwidth to our young people. And that was a lot harder than you would think. With our young people at Covenant House, to just shift that in a second, we had to do a lot around education, a lot around masks and PPE, et cetera. And this was countrywide and in Canada as well. And I'm going to say in Nicaragua, we had a political issue emerge as well.
Thank you for sharing. Nithiya, is there something you would share about what you've seen in terms of homelessness work in the context of the pandemic?
Well, I think I would expand a little bit from just thinking about homelessness work, but also think about it in the context of city powers. I think that one of the things that was most exciting to me about the past few months is to see that the city can and should be doing a lot more in terms of stabilizing people in their existing housing and to take action on the issue of homelessness. And we actually saw them doing that during COVID. In some ways, it was very gratifying to me because as someone, I still consider myself, even during this transitional period, to be primarily an observer of government, although soon I will be part of it. But as someone who was an observer of government and who argued as an activist and as a community leader that the city had a lot more powers than it claimed it did, it was very gratifying to see them own those powers and to use those to help people. And I think that's really exciting. And I think they were rewarded for it. People were very excited to see what the city did in the wake of COVID. And I think more of that kind of action is possible, and it's really exciting.
That was an amazing segue, and I'm going to stay with you for a second, Nithiya. That point you just raised, so amazing action being taken, it sounds like, in Los Angeles, and reading about the work that LASA did on getting people into hotels, among, I'm sure, a wide range of other things. Here in Connecticut, we were able to place a lot of folks experiencing homelessness into hotels to decongregate shelters. I was able to be part of an effort to launch sort of outdoor drop-in centers, sort of to provide resources to people experiencing homelessness. We saw eviction moratoriums of various strengths get deployed across the country, and I'm sure that's just the tip of the iceberg. So there was in some ways, and I think we could probably critique a lot of it, but there was an exciting level of public response from a public health perspective. And, I think I mentioned this to Secretary Donovan earlier, but one of the things that has been hard to watch, I think, is, again, I was struck that yesterday was the highest death toll due to COVID across the U.S. Yet. And at the same time, a lot of our programs, at least here in Connecticut, have wound down or are winding down. And I know the same is in Massachusetts. I'm curious, if there was one policy, maybe this is too concerning of a question if folks on the panel want to respond otherwise, but if there was one policy that you saw get deployed, whether it's locally in LA or for the other folks on the panel in your community, or something more broad that you could say can we just please keep this for the long term? Is there one that you would highlight?
Well, for me, I think that, here in Los Angeles, one of the biggest challenges, I think, has been rising frustration around homelessness among residents. So during my campaign, a lot of what I did when I was talking to residents who were living in neighborhoods who were in housing was in explaining to them the incredible gap between the availability of shelter and housing for people experiencing homelessness, and how that gap was so immense. I mean, right now we have less than a quarter of the shelter beds that we need for our unhoused population. The number of housing units available is incredibly small relative to the amount of need. And I think the thing that was most exciting for me in this moment, in having those conversations, was to see people understand that closing that gap would also help solve the problem of homelessness here in Los Angeles. And over these past few months, we've seen a real investment in closing that gap. And I think that, to me, is the most exciting thing, is to say that investments in housing can really help address homelessness directly. Seems like a very straightforward policy intervention, but I think one that was very exciting to see actually happen here in LA.
Thank you for highlighting that. Let's stay in LA. Heidi, would you mind sharing if there was one thing either that LAHSA did or that you saw more broadly that you wish there was, if it's funding that's a barrier or whatever, that you could continue in perpetuity? I'd love to get a sense from you.
Yeah, it goes on my initial comments where I would love to see the continued commitment because the power of the federal government, the state, the city, the county, LAHSA, all coming together with an aligned goal and putting our resources behind that created momentum like we never believed. And it would really be a shame to go back to the status quo after COVID, just because we don't see it as a crisis anymore.
Yeah, really, really well said. Angela and Hanan, do either of you have a thought on a policy you wish you could see? Angela, yeah, take it away.
I'm going to say a policy I wish I could see, period, which is that homelessness takes up so many different dimensions. There's the homeless and housing thing, and that's emergency, and there's long-term housing elements, and there's mental health issues, and there's drug issues, and there are so many disparate funding streams. I would like to see there to be a more aligned and collective approach to addressing the issues that our homeless people suffer with, and pulling those together, not only pooling resources, but understanding that it isn't just one thing, it's a myriad of things, I think would be helpful.
Yeah, something that resonates for me from that, and similar to what Heidi said, is like there was just a little, and actually what Nithiya said, like there has been a will to just say, like, let's cut barriers, let's make things happen, let's get it done. And right, could we have that urgency and momentum at all times? Hanan, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think my first thought is, when we think about affordable housing, how do we make sure that units are built throughout all different zip codes and not limited to a specific region and a specific community, so that we do give families opportunities to go to good schools and to go to live in safe neighborhoods that are not declining or unsafe. And then if that was to be in each region, we need to have this number of units. Who is in charge of actually monitoring that and actually making sure these are implemented and followed up on? I think that first resonates to me. And then to just piggyback a little bit on what Heidi said is, we've seen this emergency response, like COVID happened and all hands on deck, homelessness is an issue, the population is at risk, let's really realign resources. And we've seen that we've moved more people into permanent housing than we've ever done historically. Can we stick to that? And can we continue to treat homelessness as a national crisis from a humanistic approach of, like, this is an issue, we have the systems in place to make the change, and not go back to status quo?
Yeah, I think, right, like homelessness has been a crisis since before COVID. Obviously, COVID makes it more dangerous, and that makes sense. But I'm hearing a lot around the perspective on sort of momentum, right? Like how can we keep that level of momentum going? And thank you, Angela, for elaborating a little bit in terms of adding some specifics to what you said, and folks can check that out in the chat. I think that's a great added piece of detail. I want to shift gears, although it's not at all unrelated, but I want to talk about racism and homelessness. and specifically how racism is inextricably linked to homelessness. So the SPARK initiative, which was a 2018 national analysis of race and homelessness out of the Center for Social Innovation in Massachusetts, found that 64% of people experiencing homelessness are Black, compared to 12.4% of the general population, and that 78.3% are people of color. They also concluded and demonstrated that poverty alone does not explain the inequity, that the proportion of Black and American Indian and Alaska Native individuals experiencing homelessness exceeds their proportion of those living in deep poverty. So I know that Hanan and Heidi have both done work on this. It's very possible that Nithiya and Angela, you have things to add. So Hanan, I'm going to start with you and then go to Heidi, and then if anybody else wants to chime in, please do. But how, in your opinion, how does housing and homelessness policy perpetuate racial inequity? And what is one policy change you would like to see implemented to address race, racism, and racial inequity?
Thanks, Sam. I think we need to begin by looking at our, for example, our homelessness response system and how our coordinated entry system prioritizes individuals. And we're using a common assessment tool that doesn't factor in racial implications or racial trauma. So how do we use tools to assess vulnerability for people of color and Blacks and African Americans so that the scores are actually aligned with the actual experience of the individual? I think that's a start when we look at policy, as we've adopted the VI SPDAT to be our go-to. And then looking at our service delivery model of when we place people in certain communities, once they move into permanent housing, what does that look like? If it's African Americans or BIPOC community, like how are we serving them and when they're in housing that are wraparound services really specific to their needs in those communities, and making sure that they're not cycling out. And then the wraparound services are so critical to remaining in housing and factoring in all the family's experience. So I think for me, it's like placing in permanent housing is not enough. It's like from there, really diving deep into understanding the historical context of the individuals, how they got there, and then looking at the level of intervention that we're doing. Is that in line with racial trauma? Do we have a deeper understanding for, can they access healthcare accurately? We've seen our team members report when they go to an emergency room with their client who's potentially experiencing a heart attack, they're not prioritized due to their skin of color, their color of skin, and that, they have high tolerance for pain. Other people are seen before them. And so how do we equip our team to also be able to speak to these racist policies that are happening right in front of us that we're not comfortable to address?
So what I'm hearing you say is that I think, to sort of make sure that I'm summing it up, let me know, but that from our assessment to our placement to our sort of support in long-term for people experiencing homelessness, there probably needs to be an analysis of how race and racism plays into each of those. I'm just wondering if you can explain what the VI SPDAT is to those on the call who don't know. What does that mean, and what is the vulnerability tool?
So the vulnerability tool is it's VI SPDAT vulnerability index assessment that we use to go through, and it asks various questions for individuals experiencing homelessness, looking at, any type of trauma they might have experienced due to being homeless, mental health, and substance use. From there, it scores folks to identify the right type of intervention or permanent housing intervention that they would be most appropriate for. So based on their score, if they get a score of, let's say, 0 to 4, the idea is that these individuals are able to self-resolve and they don't really need financial resources or assistance. And then if it's a higher score up to like 5, 6, or up to 7, they could do rapid rehousing, which is shallow subsidy, light touch, where we place them in housing, they get rental assistance for a short amount of time, and they can stabilize on their own after that. And then if you could score higher than 8, is you need permanent supportive housing, where if you don't have the supportive services in permanent housing, you may not be able to stabilize. So you have that long-term case management need to stabilize. And so we use those to categorize individuals and saying, oh, this is the right type of permanent housing intervention for you. And so that scoring system is flawed, and when we look at it from a racial lens.
Sorry to ask one more follow-up, could you say, so it's flawed, and I don't know if it's easy to give an example or a summary of what we're missing with that tool from a race perspective?
So what we're missing is that how someone's experience as a Black person could have impacted and continued their homelessness. We want people's homelessness to be rare and brief, and that we want people to move through the system quickly, but being Black in itself has prevented them from being able to access certain resources that might be available for their white counterparts.
So there's no race lens, and then if we say, okay, we have this race blind tool in a United States context with structural racism baked in, that we're failing. Is that an okay summary? That was such an amazing overview, Hanan. Thank you for providing that. I think that was really, really helpful. Heidi, I know that LASA has looked at race and racism and homelessness in Los Angeles. I'm wondering if you could speak again, since I know we had a couple of great follow-ups to how you see racism sort of perpetuated within the homelessness system, and then if there was one structural fix or one policy fix to try and better address race and racism and racial inequity.
Yeah, so for those who aren't aware and who want to know more about what we've done in LA, LASA convened the Ad Hoc Committee on Black People Experiencing Homelessness, who put out an extensive report just a couple years ago that really captured feedback from people with lived expertise, from people who are impacted, and recommendations on how systemically we can address this issue, recognizing the homeless system is the safety net of last resort. By the time you come to our front door, every other system has failed you many times over. And so there's a lot to unpack there. So the first thing we absolutely need to do, and we did through the ad hoc work, is name it. Name it, call it out, recognize it, and acknowledge that racism is real, it exists, and ensure that what we do in our policies and our programming, in how we deliver services, is not further perpetuating the inequities that exist further upstream. I'll give you one concrete example with Project Roomkey, because when we think about policy, what we measure really matters, and the data that we put out really matters. As we were looking at Project Roomkey, we tried to find hotels and motels across the county that wanted to partner with us to host people who were unhoused. We noticed through our data that while we were locating sites and we were putting people from the surrounding area in these hotels, most of the people that we were putting in were white. So we started looking at, why are we only placing white people? If the placement tool itself is blind, why is this happening? And what we quickly realized was the areas where we see really big overrepresentation of Black and African-American brown communities is in areas like South LA that don't have hotels and motels available for us to use. Therefore, these communities were being left out of those resources that we are providing. So we were able to shift how we prioritize people to make sure that we were overcorrecting for the inequity that was happening. And by the end, we actually had more Black, African-American, and brown people in Project Roomkey than white. But that takes really deliberate data measurement and the ability to quickly make adjustments, because we know that it's the right thing to do. And without it, we'll further perpetuate those inequities.
Thank you for sharing that, both the overall context and the specific example. I'm mindful that we're starting to run short on time, and this is an incredibly important issue. So if Nithiya or Angela want to add anything, now's your chance, or I can move on to our perhaps last question or next question. Yeah, Angela, take it away. Yeah.
I'm just going to briefly say that one of the things that Covenant House is doing now, we disproportionately serve people of color. There's no question about that. But we're also looking inwardly at ourselves and trying to make sure that we are honoring the people who we serve without exploiting their stories. We're spending a lot of time making sure that we address the people that we serve with the appropriate level of dignity.
That's really well said, and that sounds like critically important work. I want to shift gears to, Nithiya, take it away if you had a thought you wanted to add in.
Nothing, a really minor point, except to say that I think there is more public support to think about how race and our homelessness policy are connected now than ever before, thanks to the largest civil rights movement in American history, the largest number of people on the streets. And so if there was a moment to really push for change and explicitly frame housing and homelessness policy in the context of race, I think that moment is now. And so, just wanted to underscore how important this conversation is and how important it is to talk about it with race as a forefronted factor.
Thank you for naming that, and well said, and that's right. I think that there are people who have poured in an immense amount of work into a racial justice movement right now, and I feel as a provider like it's on us to say, okay, well, hopefully we've been doing the work all along, and there's momentum now that has been created by people doing the work, and we need to make sure that yields long-term structural change. So so well said. I'm going to go ahead and shift gears into maybe our last bucket of area, which is about the role of policy at the municipal level. We obviously have, or the regional level, we have folks sort of in that, although I know, Angela, you do work more internationally, but you obviously support specific sites. Of course, our keynote speaker, Binyamin Appelbaum, in his op-ed wrote that, in order to house all of its people currently experiencing homelessness in King County, Washington, the home of Seattle, they would need to more than double their homelessness budget, and which would be about 5% of their county's budget. But for the federal government, that would be a rounding error, right? That would sort of be this tiny amount. On the other hand, I know I've organized in communities in Massachusetts and Connecticut to open youth homeless shelters, and I love both of the communities that I've been part of, and I'm proud of them. But I've heard pushback that goes something like this. Sure, we in this community are welcoming, and we do a lot to address homelessness, but we can't serve the whole region, right? We can't serve Greater New Haven. We can't serve the whole Boston area in our community, and so therefore, sort of our hands are tied in order to do more. I would love to start with you, Nithiya. What do you think what would you say is the right role big question, for Los Angeles to play in ending homelessness? And what would you respond to somebody who says there's no way that we as a municipality can do the work of California, or the work of LA County, or the work of the country?
I guess my perspective has always really been that I feel like I'm not really ready to have that conversation yet about where we need to stop doing work. We haven't done enough yet. We haven't built the number of housing units. We haven't made the number of shelter beds available. We haven't put the amount of money into services yet that, where we can start thinking about, okay, where do our efforts stop? Because we have such an immense gap in kind of the kinds of housing and shelter units that we have available compared to the number of people who are actually experiencing homelessness. We have such an immense gap in terms of the kinds of anti-eviction efforts and kind of support that people need in order to stay housed. And I keep emphasizing this, we have to also think about what we're doing upstream in order to make sure that we're not continuing to see a rise in homelessness. And so those efforts, I think there is still so much more to be done. And again, that was really the story that we were telling on the campaign trail. And I think a story that found a great deal of support. And that's really the message that I really want to share with I think the broader audience for this, is that at least when I was speaking to residents, even residents who came into conversations with a lot of anger and frustration around the rise in homelessness in Los Angeles, when they are confronted with the lack of resources for this issue, or the lack of the right kinds of resources to address this issue, I think for most people, compassion is really the way in which they want to respond to this crisis. And I think allowing for people to have a space to lead with compassion and evidence is what we need to be doing as policymakers and as people who are kind of leaders in this space. So I'm really excited to hopefully do more of that when I do finally take office.
That's really inspiring. We are in our last couple minutes, and I would love to give a chance for everybody to respond to this, but we've had such a rich conversation. I think we probably have room for one more person if they want to add a response to the question of what can we as a municipality do. If Heidi, Angela, or Hanan, you want to add something, I would love to have you add, but if not, we can call it a great conversation had. Heidi, do you want to add one last closing thought?
Sure. My big thing is just continue to say yes to housing, say yes to the development in your backyard, in your neighborhood, and recognize these people are our neighbors. Although they're unhoused, they're our neighbors and a part of our community. And time after time, we see that resolving people's homelessness and moving them inside is the better option for them. It's the less expensive option over time. And so all of the evidence points towards why that's the right reason, in addition to the moral imperative that we have to address the crisis.
Well said, Angela and Hanan. I'm so sorry that we couldn't come to you on that last question, but I just want to say I'm incredibly inspired by the four of you. I think the thought that we closed with, which is to say on race and racism, right, we have to identify proactive ways to see this and to not assume that a race-blind approach makes sense, but to proactively seek it out. And then the notion of leading with compassion, saying yes. And Nithiya, I'm just so happy that you are going to become an elected official, because the notion that it's our elected officials' roles to say, you know, I hear that pain and that frustration, and maybe even your kind of sadness, right, at homelessness. And let's turn that from maybe saying, okay, so we need to criminalize homelessness or get them off the streets or you know, get them out of our neighborhood, but to say, yes, right, let's lead with compassion. I'll just use your words to close. So I'm incredibly grateful to the four of you for this conversation. I'm inspired, and I hope everybody in the audience enjoyed this. I think in closing, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to John, who's going to frame up our final panel of the day. Thank you all so much for this conversation.
Hello again, and echoing Sam, I hope you're finding this as educational and inspiring as I am. Well, so I'm John Friedman. I'm back to introduce the third panel and its moderator, though please don't log off when the panel ends, because we're going to conclude today's program with a 15-minute wrap-up conversation by the moderator. So we're going to bring them all together at the end to kind of talk about what they've heard, maybe some conclusions, open questions. So that should be really interesting. In any case, panel 3, one more thing. I also want to know, because the questions come up a lot, this event is being recorded, and we will be publishing a link where you can go back and watch the whole thing again, or check out a part that you've missed, or tell a friend about. So that's all going to happen. In any case, okay, so panel 3 is titled Action, Accelerating Implementation. And you might notice it has the only title of all the panels that doesn't pose a question. And that's no accident, because the panelists for this third panel, they're already showing how in a multitude of ways homelessness can be eradicated. That, as several other panelists have previously noted, and will continue to notice, it is a solvable problem if we choose it to be. So for this, we have another distinguished moderator in Kofi Akakpo, who's currently finishing up his Master of Architecture degree at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, GSD. Kofi originally hails from Ghana, where he spent several years working with the noted architect Joe Oseato before coming to the U.S. and earning his first degree, a BS in architecture at Ohio State. At the GSD, Kofi is working on a research project that explores how spaces can maintain their unique cultural identity in an increasingly multicultural world. So Kofi, you're in charge.
Thank you very much, John. And I'll get right to it. Our first panelist is Rosanne Haggerty, founder of Common Ground Community and current president and chief executive officer of Community Solutions, a collective that believes that we can create a future where homelessness is never inevitable or a way of life. She's an internationally recognized leader in developing innovative strategies to end homelessness and strengthen communities. Haggerty was a Japan Society Public Policy Fellow and is a MacArthur Foundation Fellow, Ashoka Senior Fellow, Hunt Alternative Fund Prime Mover, and the recipient of several honors, including the Jane Jacobs Medal for New Ideas and Activism from the Rockefeller Foundation, Social Entrepreneur of the Year from the Schwab Foundation, Cooper Hewitt and Smithsonian Design Museum's National Design Award, and Independent Sector's John W. Gardner Leadership Award. With that, I'll invite Rosanne to take over.
Thank you so much. Really a pleasure to be here in this final panel. Let me begin by just posing a few questions. What if we've been all wrong about the way we've understood homelessness? And what if it reflects not individual misfortune, but a massive system design failure? And what if communities were intentional about building systems designed to make homelessness rare and housing crises brief? Well, these are the realities that are driving our work at Community Solutions and in the Built for Zero movement that we lead, and that now involves 84 cities and counties and regions across the country that are part of this movement that's proving that this system redesign path is the way to defeat homelessness. More than half of the communities, as you see, are now showing reductions in homelessness, and 13 have durably ended chronic or veteran homelessness and have the systems in place to keep the problem solved and to spread those system design solutions to other populations until the entire community is able to stay ahead of the problem. And Built for Zero, and at the heart of Built for Zero, is frankly a notion of shared accountability across the whole community for reaching that sustainable, racially equitable end to homelessness, using a measure that we have developed with our communities that we call functional zero. And that means, as in public health, that a community has a system in place to prevent most homelessness, to quickly flag new cases and promptly resolve crises involving risks of homelessness or new experiences of homelessness across their whole population, that it becomes a quickly solved problem. Well, I've been working on this issue for decades now. And like most people, I used to buy into the prevailing stories about homelessness, that it was a housing supply problem alone, or that there wasn't enough money going into the system or into the solutions to the problem, or that there were people who didn't want help and were choosing life on the street. And initially, as the result of really kind of believing some of this, our team began building housing. We built thousands of units for those experiencing homelessness, affordable and permanent supportive housing units in and around New York City. And I think about those days and like imagining some magical sorting out process would happen as I recollect that some invisible hand would direct some solution where we'd open a building and then those on the street around us would disappear and suddenly be housed. Well, that's not what happened. And we finally began to ask why. More housing, more homelessness, and why these connections weren't happening. And so what we did, we brought together individuals experiencing homelessness and staff from the many agencies working on homelessness just in our neighborhood in Midtown Manhattan at that time, to map out what was required for a single person to move from the street into a home through all the requirements and eligibility criteria created by each organization, our own included, that had a role to play in the process. And as you can see, it's a mess. It took hours for groups to even figure out if there was a process. Participants had never seen beyond their own role to see the whole sort of insane picture of what we'd inadvertently created and discover that by each of us operating as a collection of independent programs, we'd made it virtually impossible for those experiencing homelessness to escape the street. And what's more, we saw that it was no one's job to end homelessness. Each of us was funded to provide a service and was judged on whether the service was provided, not whether it was effective in contributing to a reduction in homelessness across our community. Well, this map was a game changer for us. We ended up taking this exercise to dozens of communities across the country and found the same thing, that systems had actually been designed to perpetuate homelessness. What we have moved on to is understanding that a starting point for designing systems that sustainably end homelessness is a shared goal. And that's what communities sign on to when they join Built for Zero, locking arms to reach a racially equitable, durable end to homelessness through a rigorous data-driven approach adapted from public health. And now a community that joins can be a city, a county, or a region. And these are often complex geographies, sprawling multi-county regions like Metro Denver, or along the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, or they're high-cost housing areas like Santa Fe or Montgomery County, Maryland, outside DC. And the next step, once the team has committed to a goal, is creating a shared person-specific real-time registry of all those experiencing homelessness in their community and building the capacity to keep that registry updated at least monthly. It's a painstaking process, but this shared picture of reality really drives everything. it makes each individual visible, as others in the sessions today have pointed out, that the key challenge is making people visible, making the problem not abstract, making it about our neighbors and individual people who we can assist out of this dreadful situation and prevent others from ever experiencing it. This is the kind of data that communities are looking at now, because housing crises and homelessness are risks that move and change daily. Because of that, communities need information that's as dynamic as the problem. And having this data that you see here guides the action of community teams made up of all the organizations working on homelessness. This information tells them whether their collective efforts are reducing homelessness at a population level, not just for individuals. You have to do both. It allows them to see where there are log jams in their system, to guide new investment to the places where it can have the greatest impact, to really understand what their housing supply gap is. There's a huge part of the housing need that can be met with better coordination. But where there's a supply gap, it's important to understand what and for whom and where, and to target resources to those actual problems in a way that actually matches up people experiencing homelessness with the housing unit, not just hoping it all sorts out. What this looks like on the ground is almost indistinguishable in Built for Zero communities from any rigorously designed effort that is serious about getting to zero on something that harms people. What you're looking at is actually a picture of the group working to eradicate polio in Nigeria. And I find it interesting that, wherever you look at where these rigorous efforts are going on, they look the same. All the key players, from those in the field to those from the central office, are together looking at the same data and iterating their next moves in order to tame a complex problem all the way through for everyone for good. And in closing, I'll leave you with what we've learned are the 5 things every community needs to have in place to end homelessness. First and most importantly is that shared goal across the community to achieve a population level result. Then you need an integrated team of all the key actors. You need a feedback loop of person-specific real-time data. You need flexible resources, which includes housing, and a menu of tested strategies, so you're not always reinventing the wheel. And I would say that systems designed with these elements could solve many other complex problems as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosanne. Our second panelist is Claire Elizabeth Williams, co-founder and CEO of Foundations for Social Change, an organization based in Vancouver, British Columbia, that developed the New Leaf Project, what it describes as a bold new approach to homelessness. The project is North America's first direct even project with people experiencing homelessness. Williams was recently placed on the 21 Founders to Watch list prepared by the Future of Good, Canada's leading digital publication covering the world of social impact. She has worked as an environmental consultant where she collaborated with Indigenous people, the private sector, and government to promote environmental protection, corporate responsibility, and sustainable land use. Take it over, Claire.
Thanks so much, Kofi. So we'll just dive into the presentation. And as Kofi said, we launched the world's first direct giving project with people who are recently homeless. And there were 3 key motivators for our work. The first was to reduce human suffering. The second was to accelerate impact. And the third was to drive meaningful risk-taking to advance social change. So we did that under the guise of a randomized control trial. We worked in partnership with the University of British Columbia to test the power of giving people who are homeless a one-time cash gift of $7,500. And we worked in partnership with the university because we knew that having a data-driven project was vital to answer the question of whether or not cash could be one of the many solutions to solving homelessness. So we had 4 different intervention groups in our trial, 2 cash groups, 2 non-cash groups. And you can see from the slide the different organization of supports. And then we also had secondary resources available to our participants. And so for the pilot project, we chose to work with people who are between 19 to 65, less than 2 years homeless. And we also chose to work with people who did not have severe mental health, substance use, and alcohol use challenges. And that's not to say that this project couldn't, or this kind of intervention couldn't work for that population. We just don't know. No one has ever done this work before, so we wanted to start small. And then our goal is to keep iterating as we move forward. So it's an open question that we are sitting with. So in terms of the demographic, we saw that most of our population actually was quite young, 42 years old, that 34% of folks had children under the age of 19. Some people had 2-3 children. The 12% of our population was Indigenous, which is actually quite low compared to the general homeless population here in the Lower Mainland. That's about 36%. So we need to do a better job of getting Indigenous people involved in our work. And we also saw that 28% of the folks we were working with were fully employed. So in terms of accelerating impact, we saw impact in 5 primary domains. The first one being housing. So within 1 month and then at 3 months, that's where the spikes were. People very quickly moved into housing, and that housing took different forms, whether it be modular housing, shared housing, or individual units. We also saw that folks reduced the number of days spent homeless as a group by 4,400. That's the equivalent of 12 years. So that's pretty remarkable. People still had $1,000 left over after 12 months, which is also incredible in a place like Vancouver, where the cost of living is really high. People were spending their money naturally on rent, food, on durable goods such as computers, bicycles, on going back to school, and also on their kids. So getting nutritious food for their kids, new clothing for their kids, and in some cases, behavioral supports, because the experience of homelessness can be incredibly traumatic for kids. We saw an increase in food security. And we also saw an increase in executive function. And I think this is a really important data point. So it's something that we don't often talk about. But the professor I work with up at UBC, her research shows that when people are living in poverty or resource poor circumstances, it affects your IQ. So you lose about 13 points, which is the difference between being 45 to 60 years of age or losing a night's sleep. And we all know how dysfunctional we are the next day if we haven't slept well. And so can you imagine trying to make really important choices to navigate your life forward, limited cognitive bandwidth? So it's a really important data point, because it shows that once people move back into stability, that they're regaining their cognitive function. And then the last piece is that there is actually a cost savings to giving people money. So there's the assumption that the status quo is cheap or free, and in fact, it's incredibly expensive. This is what I call the darling of our data set. And why I say that is it fundamentally challenges everything we believe about homelessness, as well as about people living in poverty, that they cannot be trusted with cash, that they're going to quote unquote waste the money on drugs, alcohol, and tobacco, that they can't make wise financial choices, nor do they know what they need to move their lives forward. And our data and evidence shows that that is just not true. In terms of direct cash transfers, we're seeing that they are a really effective way of accelerating impact in the space of homelessness reduction, as well as amplifying impact. And they're just one tool in the toolbox. So there is no one-size-fits-all solution to homelessness. And I think you're getting that from the speakers that have come here today. It's a really complex problem, and it requires a diversity of voices and a diversity of approaches. This is not a homogenous population. They have unique needs, just like we do in the general population. We all have different wants, needs, and desires, and there are things that are going to work for us and things that are not going to work for us. And we're finding that even in a complex urban environment like Vancouver, where there's an incredibly high cost of living, we're still seeing impact in these 5 primary domains. So that's really incredible. And beyond the individual impact, we're also seeing that they're a cost-effective solution, and that, you know, there's power to giving people agency, to giving them dignity, and to really communicating to them that we believe in them. And I think that's a really powerful statement to be making, especially to marginalized populations. So thank you for this opportunity to share.
Thank you very much, Claire. Our next panelist is Sam Klein. Sam is an engineer and experimental ontologist currently developing the Underlay project for federating global public knowledge. He's a co-founder of the Knowledge Futures Group, designing ways to record and curate research that minimizes barriers to entry and addresses systemic bias. He previously served as trustee of the Wikimedia Foundation, content director for One Laptop Per Child, and built tools for translation, stargazing, and teaching physics. Welcome, Sam.
Thanks so much, Kofi. Housing is a human right, and homelessness is a collective failure of social design, as others have mentioned. So solving it is a question of collective action. I work on the Underlay project, building a distributed public knowledge graph. We help people connect open data and capture context that can inspire and support its reuse. This helps people working on different facets of the same problem build on one another's work and make progress together. Good data can accelerate a project, and a universe of good data can accelerate a nation. If we are to end homelessness now without delay, we need to be able to understand and respond to it at a community level. We also need to be able to take what works in one place, tweak it, and apply it somewhere else. If we can find a way to increase service or capacity or decrease construction costs or time by an order of magnitude in one place, we should have a sense of which communities come next. What makes data easier to generalize? We need living data to capture changes in communities as they evolve so we can project forward in time. We need context to understand when two communities share enough of a starting point to share solution templates. And we need connection to identify collaborators and complementary initiatives, to be in touch with the right people to run models that work in our own neighborhoods. Strong contacts in a community can help realize existing programs in a new context. This is a combination of knowing what has been done elsewhere that has worked and knowing what your community, what questions you could answer to quickly confirm what your community needs. That's the kind of coordination that we need to build an underlay for housing. For example, good data will answer these three questions. What's the scope of the problem and the cost to your community? How is that changing over time? Second, what solutions are working or have worked in the past? And third, how are we doing? Is your community making progress? How effective are local attempts compared to similar attempts elsewhere or compared to their own self-reported goals? The scope of homelessness in our cities and the opportunity cost of allowing it to persist is often hidden. When we fail to house people, the resulting cost far exceeds the cost of providing permanent housing in the first place. We've heard some examples of how that's the case. To see this, we need repeatable ways to combine many sources to perceive how costs spread out across the community and how the costs compound over time. For example, point-in-time homeless counts are widely referenced. People were quoting 500,000 as an estimate of homelessness in the US today, but that's a lower bound, undercounting the true figure by a factor of 2 or more. A full accounting of the people and families affected should include groups overlooked, such as those jailed while homeless, which is a crisis in its own right. If you silo prison and homelessness data, imprisoning the homeless looks like a reduction in the homeless count, and it looks like a rise in successful crime fighting. Whereas in reality, we're spending massive sums to keep people in unhealthy cycles. We also need a better understanding of what's working in which contexts. Built for Zero and the New Leaf Project are great examples of programs that have seen recent success. Let's fill out the map of approaches and the context in which they work and where else they might apply. For example, COVID has spurred both a rise in evictions and these large relief bills for emergency housing. Which existing programs have the flexibility and capacity to be part of that work on a timescale of months? And if your community has programs that claim to be providing those urgent services, how could you see if that's really happening? We need to speed up these sorts of feedback loops that track how things are working to see what progress is being made. Once you found a configuration for a system that works in a wide range of communities, you want others to try it and to confirm that it works for them. Conversely, many costly programs are slow to spend allocated funds or not working as advertised. We need current data to know how our cities are doing. Every day there's still homelessness in your community, you should be able to ask what's missing and find a reasonable answer. Let's address these missing gaps together. We've started compiling a catalog of projects, designs, and data online at housing.pubpub.org. Check it out. You'll find a form for sharing data sets that you rely on or requesting data that you need and a way to get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. And then our final panelist is Kevin Hirai. Kevin is the Chief Operating Officer of Flyaway Homes. Flyaway Homes is based in Los Angeles, California, and has introduced a scalable, replicable, fundable, and cost-effective model for building permanent supportive housing in 1/3 of the time and for 1/3 of the cost per person of the traditional development model. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you very much for having me. I wanted to, I think, first start Flyaway Homes. So we are a permanent supportive housing developer, but by no means are we a traditional permanent supportive housing developer. And so I think it's important to understand that we really were formed and come from a committee, the Permanent Supportive Housing Committee of one of the larger social service agencies in Los Angeles. And so basically we were a group of concerned individuals, board members of this agency that looked at essentially a community solution. You know, what we're providing great services for our clients. Now they're ready to be housed, but the problem is we don't have the housing and we're not real estate developers. So within this committee over years, we basically came up with a flyaway homes model. So some of the things that we talked about over several years within this community are what takes development so long as far as construction. We also realized that part of the problem were the funding mechanisms tied to traditionally low-income housing tax credit developed supportive housing. And we thought about, what are the different tools that are being used in other areas, such as in Europe, where they use social impact bonds, which recognize the cost to society, the real cost, and then raise money to basically offset that cost to produce housing and other things to combat those social inequities. And so we looked at social impact equity from there as a possible funding tool. And we really wanted to come up with a scalable, essentially production model that could deliver thousands of units, basically going back to the primal hut idea that Michael Lehrer was introduced at the beginning of this seminar, which is, the essential housing for what people could at that time afford using what they had available, SSI and these different subsidies. And so throughout this whole thought process, we wanted to keep in mind when we do deliver this housing, it's got to be of a certain quality. And so the idea of, the three-legged project management stool, cost, speed, and quality, one's got to give. We turn to modular construction as sort of the solution to deliver the quality or deliver the speed and the cost while maintaining the quality. So we actually are actually trying to do this. We have two projects one project that's completed. This is the second project under development. But we decided that modular was a way to develop and systematize and really produce this type of housing at scale at a cost that we can afford. And so these are some pictures of a development that we've got under development right now, ready to open in February of next year. And so really what we're trying to do as a jump off from the first two developments is create an alternate development ecosystem where we could build 50 developments and really provide the data to show the cost savings when you get replicability introduced, and then at scale, what those costs could eventually be driven down to from what we know is a really high $505,000 per person in the city of LA. And so we're trying to do these different things, systemize, repeat, and scale. Additionally, the impact that this is having that we want to include as part of our model is, pushing the line of racial equity, conscious design, and this notion of getting the community involved and reducing NIMBYism. So again, I talked a little bit about the people concerned, their social services agency, and this is really where we as a developer come from, the lived experience side, talking and working with our clients. Is really where the model comes from and allows us to hopefully be able to scale along with them and provide the housing with the supportive services that we know can help a lot of people. Maybe not everybody, it's not the only solution, but it's definitely a big part of the solution. And so we've won a couple of grants, recognizing that this is a potential way to accelerate the development production of PSH, and we're going to try to use those grants to accelerate what we're trying to innovate. And then hopefully with the streamlining and systemization of this development process, we'll be able to really impact the numbers of chronically homeless that are in LA, 20,000 at the current time. And this is the existing development. Welcome you all to learn more. Come to our website and you can see we have a lot of media pieces that you can see how this type of housing does help families and individuals in need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And at this point, I would like to invite the rest of the panelists to join, to maybe turn on their camera so we can engage in conversation. And since our panel is trying to focus on acceleration, I would like us to focus on that to begin. I would like our panelists to talk specifically about acceleration. What are the tools that you need to see positive change faster? And perhaps we can start with Claire.
Yeah, for us, it's funding because this is kind of a fringe idea. And so we're still trying to create buy-in from people and the general public that this is a viable option in the toolbox to solve homelessness. And I think it works beautifully in parallel with things like housing. Housing takes time to build, but during that time of build, people do need help and support, and our shelters are at capacity. And so from where we stand, the direct cash transfer is just such a simple, elegant, and immediate way to impact people's lives.
Rosanne, maybe we can.
Change the incentive structure. For instance, in the United States, our federal government provides billions of dollars annually to communities to address homelessness. But nowhere in the funding awards will you see that the goal is to reduce homelessness. It's reinforcing this idea of many, many programs without a collective and measurable goal to actually see that this is adding up to less homelessness. So it's the incentive structure, something that we actually have much more control over than we might imagine.
Kevin?
Yeah, I think a couple of things as far as the development of housing. Funding, obviously, if there was a funding stream that didn't have as many strings attached, that obviously would make things easier. And then on a policy level, I think that the city of Los Angeles, I give them a lot of credit for introducing and passing zoning regulations that allow for and encourage supportive and affordable housing. And I think that that's one tool to accelerate and sort of give the rights to developers that want to build this type of property, make it a little bit easier for them to do.
And perhaps Sam?
I'll second what Rosanne said, and also faster feedback loops. Mm-hmm. We need visibility into how things are working and what opportunities are there that aren't being tried right now, but could be, and are basically the opportunity cost of committing. A lot of the major projects that people pin their hopes on are expensive and have long lead times. And when there are delays, all of the incentives point away from being open about that. So giving communities ways to monitor themselves and advocate for the change that they need and don't have.
That's great. And I think that, Sam, you did a good job in sort of telling us the importance of like data. And I feel like a lot of the conversation seems to be pointing towards data as a useful tool. And it seems to me that data has become something that makes it easier to communicate and to measure the success of whatever we're doing. And I was very interested in like the Rosanne, Claire, and Kevin. If there was data that you find is perhaps missing, that could help to make your work easier, and that you think perhaps Sam might focus on making more publicly available to us.
Well, I think Sam's work could actually be enormously important and valuable to our work with communities and helping us kind of read some of the overall patterns. But what we have found is the essential starting point information that communities need is that which makes every person and family visible and accounts for who is experiencing homelessness in real time. For years and years, we tend to think of this as just a large anonymous problem, and that has been a singular barrier to solving it. And even right now, the one data standard the country has is every 2 years doing an estimated count on one night in January, like useless for actually taking action on a problem. And so getting down to the person level and seeing how all of the community's efforts are adding up for anyone experiencing homelessness is that very granular data, and then much more active, as Sam said, rapid feedback loop in terms of how the whole picture looks week after week, month after month. That's not going to come at this point from an algorithm. It's going to come from like information that's built from the ground up by people doing the work.
Kevin, do you have any thoughts on that, perhaps?
Yeah, in the beginning, Michael Lehrer mentioned he was part of this Restore Neighborhoods LA. We're a peer HHH Innovation Challenge Award winner with them. And what I think one of the really smart things that the city of LA is doing with these awardees is they're really engaged in tracking the data, because they recognize that there was a big lack of why is this costing so much, what's taking it so long. And so as part of this HHH Innovation Challenge, they're now tracking very closely and really trying to identify what are the barriers, what could, accelerate these things. And so I think that, hopefully we'll get some better data sets from people who are really motivated to figure out what's going on and how we can do things better. So I think that, there is a lot that lies in data and people are working on it.
Claire, do you have anything to add or?
Yeah, I would say from our perspective, and it's a Canadian perspective as well, I don't know if we necessarily need more data, but we need more consistency. We need more sharing. So a lot of our organizations work in silos. They're not actively sharing their data. They're also measuring different things. So it makes it very hard to understand the situation as a whole. You can really only understand things at the level of a shelter, and more transparency. And I think, coordinating what we're measuring so that we are all speaking the same language would be incredibly helpful to helping solve this challenge.
Right. I was interested in something that Rosanne sort of hinted at in her last response while talking about data. And I think you were beginning to suggest that perhaps not everything would be captured by data. And I think that that's a very important point to make, because we're dealing with, a sensitive topic. And there's a social dimension to it that might not necessarily be captured by data. And so I thought it's very important to keep that in mind as we move forward as well. So I was kind of, I guess, to formulate that into a question, like how do you communicate to people the importance of aspects that might not be captured by data or good data?
Well, one, I'll tell you just two windows into that are so vital as we work with our communities on implementing a racially equitable framework for reducing homelessness. Homelessness is so disproportionately suffered by Black and Native Americans in the United States. You actually have to ask qualitative questions like, do you believe the system is treating you fairly, that you are having an experience that preserves your dignity as you go through it? And I think that's actually the measure, in addition to, are we reducing homelessness within our community? Like, is the experience of homelessness itself, and I think Richard Sennett said earlier, are we moving away from a demonization or moralization of the issue to a real, problem-solving, respectful mindset that owns this problem as a community problem, not as a problem of individuals who are suffering.
Yeah, and to Rosanne,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Kofi. To Rosanne's point, I do think the qualitative piece is really important, and we took a mixed methods approach, so using both qual and quantitative data. But to be honest with you, as the co-founder, I come to this problem from the heart, and it was only through the encouragement of my academic partners and my co-founder that we also brought in the head, which is the data piece. And data speaks to some people, but like you said, it doesn't speak to others. And this is, I am driven by story. I'm driven by individual experiences. I'm driven by seeing the people behind the issue. Some people spoke in previous panels about, despite it being a prevalent issue that's very visible in our communities, those people are actually quite invisible. And so we've now started to produce videos of our participants, and you see the human being behind the suffering, behind the circumstance. And to me, that's more compelling than the data. But not everybody speaks the language of the heart. And so I think it's really important to have that balanced approach.
Yeah. Sam, were you about to say something? I couldn't tell if you were or not.
Oh, just agreeing. We need that kind of data, and it's really helpful to have it at scale, to have a way for people to contribute it wherever they are, even without knowing who's going to be able to compile it into a more meaningful lens.
Yeah, and Sam, I'm interested in your position. I sort of framed the question as there's certain things that are beyond data, but I'm interested in your opinion as to whether that's necessarily the case. Is it that I'm perhaps missing how that information could be captured in data? Can you perhaps think of ways that certain things that we don't necessarily have in data that I can't think would be captured in data can actually be captured in data, and so your role becomes even more pivotal to the problem?
I think these qualitative questions and questions of the patterns of society building that move us away from homelessness, the patterns themselves are worth describing. Data is maybe a cold and inhuman way to talk about things, but we should all be building patterns of civilization that don't have this failure mode. And anytime you engage with one, if you when you talk to people and find out if they feel that they're being treated with respect or appropriately, whatever you learn from that could be described as in a way that could be abstracted or shared with another community. And there's a little bit of work. You can imagine having the raw interview transcripts and then having the discussions about what patterns this might fall into and what solutions might work, like patterns of resolving social disputes and interpersonal challenges.
Kevin, I had a specific question for you. One of the things that I thought was interesting about what the work that you're doing is the whole idea of a third of the time, a third of the cost. Now you're practicing in a city that is very expensive, to build it and to live in generally. And I'm kind of interested in that is obviously a huge selling point, but how those metrics have evolved as your company has evolved to tackle the problem in perhaps different parts of the city, but also when you sort of market the model using such specifics, what happens when those models change? What happens when you have to scale up and go from maybe single units to double units and things like that? When you have to go from designing housing for individuals to designing housing for families, how does that affect how you sort of market your model to people?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that we're agnostic from many different standpoints. Funding agnostic, whatever funding source can make it happen, we'll use. Whatever construction methodology, design methodology will make it happen, we'll use. And so from that perspective, I think that, the caveat on that third the time, third the cost is that we use a shared housing model. And so traditional HUD funded housing is one person per one studio unit. And, we recognize that it's not for everybody, but that there's definitely a large population that can live and actually thrive in a shared housing situation. So if you can amortize the cost of a bathroom and a kitchen over 2 residents, as opposed to just one, that drives the cost down. So again, from an agnostic standpoint, we're looking at cost per person to create this primal hut, right? A place for this person to reside at a cost. And so we're not constrained by HUD only funds on a per person basis. We try to kind of take all of those constraints off. If we had, a funding source that didn't dictate that, what could we do? What would that look like? And so that's sort of how we operate. And then it's this feedback loop that we're talking about. So if it turns out that there's a better way to do it, we want to learn about that. And we want to provide that data or that information. One of the biggest problems that Flyaway confronted coming into this thing was the idea of NIMBYism, right? Everybody wants to solve the problem, but just not near me, not near my home, right? And so part of what we're trying to do is provide these stories and anecdotes that aren't data, but they're basically who's actually living, who's benefiting from this PSH that you're building. And just sharing that story, I think it's a lot of community support and buy-in and understanding that this is not, not going to attract a bad element to the neighborhood, that this is actually something that's good for the neighborhood. And then that, by doing it first, and then having people give that feedback, it sort of organically grows, like this community solutions concept, right? Getting the buy-in from the neighbors, getting the buy-in from, hopefully eventually investors that understand that, underwriting this type of activity is a worthwhile thing.
Yeah, I think one thing that has been sort of mentioned by several panelists throughout the day is the role that perception plays in the problem of homelessness. And there seems to be a general attitude towards people who are homeless as having, done something wrong, and I'm sort of wondering, since we're in since we're in a design school, or we're being hosted at a design school, wondering how like design can help to combat that that problem. Perhaps the empathetic design models that can help to change the perception of housing, for instance. Kevin?
Yeah, I think that's what we're trying to show. I think that there are definitely design considerations. I mean, we're learning. Again, it's sort of do and then learn and then reiterate. And so we've learned a lot of design mistakes that we've made the first time around. We're trying to improve upon, and we're never going to just settle and say this is the end all be all, but we're trying to find something that can be systematized and scaled. That's the ultimate goal.
Yeah. Do any of the other panelists perhaps want to talk about empathy and changing attitudes generally as an approach?
Yeah, I think it's vital. Because if we're designing the solutions based on a broken narrative and insidious stereotypes, then everything we do is counterproductive and preventing us from making any meaningful change on the issue. So I think we all have to just take a step back and look at where we're coming from, where our perception is coming from. And even as someone, I'm a land use planner and environmental consultant. So even when I moved into this space, I had to check myself on my mental map of homelessness. And I don't think it's the fault of anybody. If you look to our movies and to our literature, we all probably hold the same image of someone who's homeless in our minds. It's usually a scruffy guy with a beard rifling through the garbage. But through our work, we're just showing that time and again, that is not the face of homelessness. It is so diverse. But if as designers, if as social policy creators, we are creating solutions based on the old guy in the garbage, how are we ever supposed to make progress on this issue? So I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's a really timely conversation to be having given what's going on in the world, and just questioning everything we know about everything and starting from ground zero and rebuilding our approach.
It's really interesting, the last point that you made, because it reminds me of a personal story that a friend shared just a few days ago. And this is a person who's in design, who's very successful in design. And they spoke about a few years ago when they had won an award and they were in a position where everybody saw them as being successful. And they were living in one of the most expensive cities in America. And they were on the verge of homelessness. They had to leave the city in order to avoid being homeless. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting, and it's important for us to remember that the image that we have in our minds of who the homeless person is not necessarily who that homeless person is. Mm-hmm. It could be, one of our colleagues, the person right next to us, that is experiencing that. Rosanne, did you have any?
I was just going to add one thing, Kofi, which is we've noticed in all of these communities that are part of Built for Zero that when communities get down to the work of identifying by name, who exactly is experiencing homelessness and what other parts of their identities are important in terms of linking them with the right housing resource, that changes everything. Because, frankly, once you know someone's name and you know a bit more about their story, it actually, it's very hard to hold any stereotypes. I've seen over and over again the biggest changes that happen in communities when that kind of recovering the person happens, is that it's the volunteers or the people at the agencies who are changed, re-energized, kind of see past, like an issue and kind of a project to be undertaken to, oh my God, this is a neighbor, this is someone whose life unfolded in this way, and shame on us in this community for allowing this to happen. That really changes, not because, I think anything other than having information that is so challenging about, what a person's experience has been, that it forces others in the community to reconsider something. It's hard to do that without the direct encounter, I find, but it always happens when that is present.
Yeah. Yes, and I think that we can perhaps look at the idea of scalability. And I'm struck by the fact that all of you guys on the panel sort of tackle the problem of homelessness from very different vantage points, right? Rosanne, I see you working at a larger scale with municipalities and trying to coordinate all these bodies towards a common vision. Well, Claire is very direct. I'm going to give you cash and I'm going to see what you do with it. Sam is working on data to make all these metrics, all these things that we can measure more visible to us. And Kevin is building houses for the people that need it. But I was wondering if we could look at the theme of scalability and how you each think that, what do you think you need to scale up the model, your model that you're working with? And perhaps we can start with Sam on this one.
Having great accessible city data, the central data from people who are designing city plans makes a big difference. The cities and countries that have effective repositories make the life of everyone else a lot easier. UK and London do a great job of sharing things like the count of unoccupied housing, which there as elsewhere is often 10 times the count of people who don't have housing. And communities of practice who know that they can find one another. What I love about Built for Zero is that it's bringing together people who are just committed to solving a challenge together and figuring it out. And this is a problem that we can solve as communities in addition to pushing for policy change. And there are a lot of things that we can do without that. So I think one important step is motivating everyone who sees this, first helping people visualize that it's a challenge in their communities among people they know. Friends and family members are touched by this, even though they don't say so, even though it's hidden. And then showing them that there's something that they can do to engage with other people.
Kevin, scalability?
Yeah, I think for us, there are a couple things. I mean, just from a construction standpoint, again, I'm very single lens. But we're looking for a modular manufacturer, that can really provide these factory-built housing modules for us to be able to scale. And it's basically somebody that can reliably deliver pre-built apartment buildings. And then in addition to this concept of social impact equity funding that is not tied to, it's basically privately raised funding. And I think that, that's where Leilani talked about the investor-driven housing. I think that Flyaway's philosophy is that if we can make this a semi-for-profit, social impact equity-driven development, that basically would bring in all the capital that we would need to develop it once we can prove the model out.
Claire?
Yeah, I think it's twofold for us. The first would be technology. So for our pilot project, because we're coming from the space of beginner's mind, it was very much boots on the ground. We used a lot of people. We spent a lot of time making mistakes and failing forward and realizing where actually we could leverage the power of technology to streamline some of our processes and almost democratize how we do business in terms of working with participants. Because for the pilot project, they were required to meet us on our time, which again introduces a power dynamic into the relationship. And we want to really meet people where they're at and work shoulder to shoulder with them. So through having kind of a live platform where people can access anytime, it really allows them to participate on their own terms. The scaling technology will also help us scale across Canada, if not the world. We have had inquiries from around the globe on how do we do this in our community and how do we do it now. So we're really passionate about building that platform out as soon as we're able. And we just got a donation towards it yesterday. So that's really great so that we can really help disseminate this work across community. And then the second piece is, again, that perception piece around homelessness, just breaking down people's mental mind maps of what homelessness is and what is possible for this population. And in this case, it's the power of cash to transform lives. And I think I'm going to speak again to the Canadian context with the pandemic. I'm really hoping that there has been a softening of attitudes around people experiencing homelessness, because all of a sudden people see that it doesn't take much to push you over the edge. All of a sudden, a change in circumstances, you lose your job. And then in the case of Canada, you look to the federal government and you say, hey, we need some money. And our government was quite responsive and gave people $2,000 a month. So I think the more we can kind of mainstream these ideas, the more we increase receptivity to innovation and just a diversity of solutions to the challenge of homelessness and other kind of intractable problems that, you know, given the amount of money and collective wisdom we've invested into these problems, we should have them well solved by now.
Rosanne, did you have any thoughts on scalability?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is to change the goal, that we should be expecting our communities, our elected officials to be ending this problem, not to be reacting to the problem. If we were serious about ending the problem, it would mean a very different kind of cultural response. I think, you know, the movement for Black Lives, Me Too, marriage equality, like there are moments where we just have to decide this is not who we are going to be anymore. And I think we have to decide we're not going to be a society that just throws money at a problem that's solvable and causes so much suffering.
Okay. Kevin, it looks like we have a direct question from one of our audience members for you. It says that you talk about the cost of financing, the Byzantine complexity of free market financing on top of mistrustful planning and zoning approval processes. And it's asking if you have a suggestion to streamline the creation of affordable or homeless housing. What is the future for social impact of public banking financing?
Yeah, so I guess we that's really what we kind of examined is, you know, well, what exactly takes longer using these different sources of financing? And I mean, the answers are simple. For instance, one bank may require you to have insurance for a certain period of time. But what happens is they get layered, and all that takes time and money and drives costs. And so basically our solution to that was, well, what if in the perfect world we just had a pot of cash? Or, you know, we asked our friends and family to basically put up money that we could use, this social impact equity that I'm talking about. So if that pot of money existed, then sure, we could use modular manufacturers without the banks or lenders really, you know, were, you know, rightfully so concerned with those types of things, but it allows us that flexibility. Whereas otherwise, you know, it really does hamstring a lot of and drives a lot of cost. So that's a very important part, is basically finding this privately raised is what we're really looking for, privately institutionally raised social impact equity fund that would underwrite these projects until the municipalities are willing to do social impact bonds.
Okay, it looks like we're coming up fast to the end here, so perhaps we can begin to wrap it up. And I would like to wrap it up, you know, by asking you all, you know, more personal question. I understand that, you know, working in the field of homelessness requires a certain personal interest. And so, like, I'm interested in what your call to action is, and if you can share that with our audience. But I think that in this moment that we find ourselves in, you know, in the time when I feel like social awareness has been sort of raised with all the challenges that we have, perhaps we can look at that through the lens of that as well. If most of the actions that have happened around, you know, protests and things like that throughout our country and our communities has sort of given you hope for the future. And if you could connect those two things to your call of action, that'd be great. And perhaps we can start with Rosanne.
Well, I think the pandemic has only reinforced something that we'd seen for a while, that we need to understand homelessness as a public health issue. And now, as we, you know, just all share in the awareness that we need to rebuild the public health infrastructure of the country, this is the moment to design homelessness out of existence, just to create, you know, the new structures that say, like, these are risks that people need not bear. And especially, I would see this as such an actionable space for committing ourselves to racial justice. When you see who in our society is suffering disproportionately, taking the will and the energy and into action, this is a problem that, as awful as it is for those who are experiencing it, it is actually not a vast problem given the size of our population. This is something that we can do, and I think our country needs to show that we can do things for each other and do things in our community, regardless of the political stripes.
Thank you, Rosanne. Sam, call to action.
Yes, we should redefine society as a place where no one is homeless. Ethically, practically, intuitively, just taking this moment where we all have to step back and think about how we live, and recognizing that we would all be better off when no one is homeless in our immediate community and across the world. And we should all just think, what can we do, and what can we do in the most local of environments without waiting for policy change, so that on the cycle of, this, we're going to reconstruct identity across the divide of the pandemic. Decide that racial justice and universal housing are an aspect of urban society, and then share how that's working in our neighborhoods.
Thank you. Claire?
Yeah, for me, it's about stepping into a place of compassion. So it's about empathizing with the other, so seeing the person behind the circumstance, but more than that, then taking action. And I encourage everybody who is tuned in today to do just that. This is not a space that I had any expertise in, but I did have an unwavering belief that there is another way to help people. And, it's so easy to put the responsibility on other people within society. Oh, well, they should do this and the government should do this. And my co-founder and I we were inspired by a TED Talk, and we're like, okay, let's do that. We feel bold enough and courageous enough to take that step. And so just because you don't come from a space and you don't necessarily have expertise in it, doesn't mean that you can't add value or help us find the solution.
Thank you. And Kevin?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I think I want to just echo what Heidi Marston was saying. It's just basically yes to more of everything. If you can, join the YIMBY movement, which is anti-NIMBY. Work on being compassionate and help where you can. The sooner the better.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. And I would like to thank all of our panelists, Rosanne, Claire, Sam, and Kevin, for sharing your thoughts on how we can actually accelerate the process to eradicating the problem of homelessness. Thank you very much. And I will hand over to Alice.
Thanks, Kofi. Hi again, everyone. So I'm back to kick off the final and brief segment of our event. John mentioned at the outset of panel 1 that all of us who've worked on design impact are really interested in what action can come out of it. It was interesting because a comment was made in the chat that the discussion we're having today isn't so different than ones that were going on in the early 20th century. So, that's a little sobering, and we want to make sure that this really is the moment that we can look back on as actually having moved the needle, because we have new tools. Data, of course, is one, communications and media. We don't really have any more excuses. So, the point's been made that we need to push our national will. We need to raise our awareness, and we need to force our politicians also to show us real action and not just reaction, as Rosanne, I think, said. So at this time, we just want to ask our moderators to come back on and tell us what they think they learned from their sessions today and what actions they might actually take next as a result. So I think we can start with Denise and then Sam and Kofi, and then you guys can talk for a little while, for a few minutes, for the time that we have remaining. And thanks to everyone who participated in this. So Denise, let's start with you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I've learned a lot today from the panelists on the panel that I moderated, but also from Kofi and from Sam and all the panelists. But I think one thing that I just think is important is that we're always trying to reframe discussions and bring the most impacted people into like the center of those discussions. And I think even here in the at the symposium today, we're in such like a privileged space to be able to talk about these systems in a way, in a particular way. And we have so many resources amongst us, and a lot of people who are listening in right now, I'm sure, have a lot of resources, have a lot of knowledge. And so I'm just like been really touched by the way that folks are really trying to use that whatever we call it, like power, resources, to address systemic issues the issues that create barriers for folks to creating more sustainable and sustainable and affordable housing. And, you know, I really appreciated hearing about all the ways that design can help bring back a lot of this, the visibility to a community that has been largely disenfranchised and made to be invisible, as we were talking about on our panel. But also, I really appreciated a lot of the conversation around not being able to pull the lack of housing or the houseless or homeless community away from the debate on race and the cyclical nature of poverty and how that affects kids and how that affects the way that we're learning and how it affects the way that we're thinking about the world and the way that people are thinking about us, and like how we end back in this place all the time. And so I really appreciated a lot of the policy discussion, particularly around just naming explicitly the connections between race and homelessness. And I think that unless we also talk about capital and neoliberalism and take a lot of lessons from Black Lives Matter and people really using their privilege to question and problematize systems in a real way, that we're not going to get anywhere. We're not going to answer the real questions. And so I've just appreciated this space to listen to folks talk about that. But yeah, I will pass it to Kofi.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think for me, I was struck by how even though several people were trying to tackle the problem of homelessness from very different points of view and very different vantage points, that there were certain common threads that seemed to sort of connect all of them. And in particular, it was like an empathy and the need for empathy in tackling the problem, and how it was important to sort of modify just what we see or just what we think of when we think of the homeless person. And I was particularly struck by the fact that a few of our panelists had a background that was not necessarily connected to disciplines that you would think would be directly confronting homelessness, but they took it upon themselves to go and work in that space and try to affect the problem directly. And so for me, leaving the conversation, I'm asking myself how I, as a designer, can work to more directly affect the problem. And I guess I'll pass it on to Sam.
Thanks, Kofi. I feel a huge amount of appreciation for both of you and the way you moderated your panels. I learned so much from both the way you talked about work that's important to you and the questions you asked. And of course, the panelists on your panel were unbelievable and so thoughtful. I want to just quickly, I think one point that Denise, that you made that I just want to lift up as a question I was next on my list, and I sort of felt regret for not being able to ask, was the question about what it means for people and who have lived experience of homelessness to be involved in policy. It's that feels fundamental. It feels like maybe we didn't quite hit that, although I do think it came up at times. And I know that a couple of folks on my panel were excited to talk about that. We're ready to talk about that, and does to me feel like, okay, when we're thinking about policy, people who are experiencing homelessness and who have experienced it have to be part of that conversation. So I really appreciate you lifting that up. I had sort of three things that jumped out to me during my panel. One was just this perspective of like, what would it look like if we maintain the urgency that we have at times felt during COVID to really advance, like to treat homelessness like the crisis it is. And I know that came up, Kofi, in your panel as well. And certainly just like the way that a couple of people on my panel said, that just made sort of shift in my thinking, and it feels like it's connected to the idea, even like that Binyamin Appelbaum brought up, Denise, and yours around like that maybe we have gotten comfortable with the idea of homelessness as a fact of life, and that there's something around both the invisibility by sweeping it into a rug, putting it in shelters, which came up today, or just ignoring it. That's really on my mind. And again, especially because we've actually demonstrated we can do a lot to reduce homelessness during COVID. The second point that came up for me was just the conversation about race and racial justice. And I think a couple panelists on my panel pointed out that that just taking a race-blind approach to homelessness can't be enough. And again, that came up in probably each panel, but that when we apply a race-blind approach to an issue that is that is imbued with systemic racism, like we're losing there. That's not enough, and we may maintain or perpetuate the same systems that we've faced. Angela on my panel talked about, we also have to look inward at our organizations, for those who run organizations, at how we may, even within our nonprofit structure, our organizational structure, be perpetuating those systemic barriers. And then just the last one, and it was, and I've loved following the chat and have agreed with so much of it. I did notice a couple of points about people, I guess in New York, were reflecting on a conversation that maybe actually homeless services shouldn't be put in residential neighborhoods. And you know, I've never lived in New York, so I don't know the local context, but you know, as Alice said, we're about to break ground on our project in New Haven, Connecticut, which I'm so excited about, but it took literally 13 months and 150 conversations with folks in a residential neighborhood about launching that project. Ultimately, I'm so happy to say that we have a huge amount of support in that neighborhood. But the point that Nithiya made about leading with compassion and saying, well, maybe what we really want is for people to not be homeless. And so let's come up with every way to say yes to that, say yes to ending people's homelessness. And so, you know, I think that sometimes we can say, well, yeah, we should be building new housing or new shelters, but maybe not here where I am because of X, Y, or Z. I think we can always come up with an X, Y, or Z. So that's on my heart, just thinking about, you know, again, even I loved the chat and I thought so many good points came up, but one that I maybe disagree with is the idea that, you know, in a residential neighborhood, we shouldn't be thinking about providing housing for homeless folks. I would add, you know, sort of like where else, right? And if we say no and we don't have another area where it should go and we can't be part of that solution, maybe we're letting those folks down. But yeah, I just feel a tremendous amount of appreciation for the conversations that were had and the level of thoughtfulness that was brought to this conversation.
Hey, that was terrific. So, well, we've reached the end. And so Alice and I would like to thank everyone involved, the numerous groups. Of course, our expert panelists, but also I want to just say at this point how impressed I was by our moderators who, I don't know if you noticed, but they're all current or recently graduated students, and they are our future leaders and our hope. So it was wonderful to see you guys so engaged, hands and all. and so okay. So also want to thank the attendees, and I want to thank the numerous others from the GSD who made this possible, and with special shout outs to Ana Maria Pinto da Silva, I love saying that, Peter Coombe, Ricky Nishimura, and from the GSD itself, the tireless and unflappable Lindsay Grant Lagrasse, Pam Larson, Peggy Burns, and Dean Sarah Whiting. Now, we've just scratched the surface of this complicated issue. So if you're looking for more information about homelessness, please see the list of resources under the Event Resources tab. Alice mentioned that earlier. You'll find it in the Design Impact website where you registered, gsdimpact.com. Now, finally, as you know, this symposium is just the second in the Design Impact series. The third, which will occur in about 3 months, actually specifically on February 25th, will be an in-depth look at all the challenges facing South Asia. There you see on the screen the longer title. But so please look out for that. And until then, thank you for joining. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of your day.